The coffee cup on the desk was still warm when Ethan Mercer vanished from the town of Logan, Ohio, population 6,212, on July 12, 1991, arrived with stifling heat, blanketing the dirt roads that ran along the edge of Hocking Hills. At 6:15 p.m., Ethan's coworker, Ray Collins, saw him wearing a green shirt, climbing into his gray pickup truck, and saying he was heading to the Porter house to pick up his son for the weekend. A resident in downtown Logan reported seeing that truck pass through the main street, the sunset reflecting off the windshield like a streak of fire. As night fell, the porch light at the Mercer home remained on, dinner grew cold on the table, and the phone rang repeatedly with no one answering. What happened in the hours that followed would haunt Logan for nearly a quarter of a century. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. In the late afternoon of summer 1991, Logan, Ohio, was immersed in a soft, thick light like pollen dust, covering the old wooden houses scattered amid the Appalachian forest region. The air carried the familiar scent of pine, and the narrow roads winding through the town retained the peaceful appearance of a place where time seemed to flow a few beats slower than the rest of the world. Ethan Mercer finished his shift at the machine shop, his hands still stained with engine oil, but his face relaxed, as if the fatigue of the long day became easier to bear when he thought about picking up his son that weekend. Just as he stepped out of the shop door, the office phone rang, an unusual occurrence for that hour in town, and Rachel Porter's voice came through, slightly hurried, slightly urgent, telling Ethan to come straight to her house to pick up Jacob instead of the usual meeting spot. The message made Ethan pause for a moment, but he didn't ask further. He just quickly wiped his hands, grabbed his keys, and walked out to the yard, where the last light of the afternoon was fading behind the hills. His truck left the shop, passing through the small town where shops were starting to pull down their shutters. An acquaintance from a store on Main Street saw Ethan drive by, just a brief moment, but enough to capture the final image of him against the sky turning deep orange. Then Logan sank into the summer evening, when the sound of cicadas blended into the tree shadows and window lights glowed with warm yellow hues. But Ethan did not return. As dinner cooled on the table, Linda Mercer began to feel her heartbeat skip intervals. Cody paced back and forth on the porch, looking down the pitch-black road in front of the house. April called repeatedly, but got no answer from Ethan, each ring squeezing a little more hope away. The whole family gathered in the small living room, the unease growing with each passing minute, as if the air in the house was thickening. They tried calling a few acquaintances, asking around if anyone had happened to see Ethan, but everyone said no. The room, once bright and warm, suddenly felt heavy, as if something wrong was lurking just beyond the thin walls. When night fully descended, and there was no reasonable explanation left to cling to, Linda picked up the phone with trembling hands and called the police. While outside, Logan remained so silent, it sent chills down the spine. Just minutes later, the sound of patrol tires turned into the driveway, blue and red lights, briefly sweeping across the windows before disappearing, leaving the figure of Deputy Mark Ellis appearing under the pale yellow porch light. Inside, the pent-up worry from the evening made the room even more oppressive, and when Ellis entered, Linda Mercer had to lightly grip the arm of the chair to stay composed. Ellis spoke in a low, steady, professional voice, trying to reassure them, but unable to hide the tension typical of missing persons cases in a small town like Logan. He opened his leather notebook and asked for every necessary detail, starting with Ethan's appearance, height, build, short brown hair, the faint scar on his left chin that everyone in the area knew. Linda added the clothes he was wearing when he left the shop, an old gray t-shirt and dark jeans, while Cody mentioned the shoes Ethan wore every day as an easily recognizable detail if someone spotted him on the road. Ellis asked about daily habits, whether Ethan had ever left without notice before, about his recent mood. Linda shook her head firmly. Ethan had never disappeared like that in his life. Then came the most important question, the last destination the family knows about. Linda and Cody answered almost simultaneously, that Ethan had left the shop to go to Rachel Porter's house at her request. Deputy Ellis noted it down, his eyes blinking slightly. The only reaction to information that opened up countless lines of reasoning, but he couldn't show that at a civilian's home. He told everyone to stay calm, saying he would pass the information to Sheriff Douglas Reed that very night. And indeed, when Ellis left the house, Sheriff Reed was roused from fitful sleep and arrived shortly after, his shirt not fully buttoned, but his eyes alert as soon as he heard the report from Ellis. In the Mercer living room, Reed sat down in the chair opposite the family, his police radio on his hip, buzzing intermittently. He re-asked a few points to ensure no discrepancies. Ethan left the shop in the late afternoon, was seen by an acquaintance passing through downtown as dusk fell, then vanished completely before the sky turned fully dark. No calls, no messages, no one saw his truck after that. Everything confirmed. Reed took notes, closed the notebook, and declared the official missing persons file for Hocking County, opened activating priority search protocol for an adult considered at risk. He used his radio to contact dispatch, requesting an area-wide alert with descriptions of Ethan and his truck. Just minutes later, the local radio station began broadcasting the urgent bulletin, the night announcer's voice coming over FM waves in a deep, clear tone. A Logan man missing, asking the community to watch the roads and report any information immediately. On the porch, the rare streetlights illuminated a thin mist, while inside, the Mercer family stood in silence, listening to the bulletin with sinking hearts. When the alert aired a second time, Sheriff Reed left with Ellis and immediately dispatched patrol teams to begin sweeping the routes Ethan might have taken from the machine shop along Logan's main road, around downtown, then toward the low forest area where the road led to the Porter house. The night deepened over Logan like a thick blanket muffling all sounds, making even the smallest noise echo farther than usual. Deputy Ellis drove the patrol car along the main route, connecting downtown to the low forest, headlights sweeping both sides of the road bordered by dense black pines. The side roads leading to Old Ridge Road were mostly unlit, with only reflective signs glowing when the car approached. Ellis slowed down in sections, observing the road surface while flashing lights into the long gaps between trees, where light penetrated then vanished instantly, as if swallowed by the forest shadows. At each curve, he reduced speed, searching for any sign, however small, a vehicle parked off-kilter, disturbed soil, the glint of metal under the canopy. But all he saw were silent dark expanses stretching to the hill's base. When they turned onto Old Ridge Road, the atmosphere felt different, so still that the two in the car felt time stretching out. This was the road that, according to the family, Ethan most likely took to reach the Porter house. Yet the road surface remained clean, as if no one had driven it since dusk began. No skid marks, no oil stains, not even disturbed dust. Ellis turned off the radio to listen, in case any sound echoed from afar, but there was only insect noise and wind rustling through leaves. They continued to the fork, one branch leading into the forest against the hills, the other straight to the Porter family property. Both branches were so dark that the road edges nearly blended into the woods. Ellis turned to Sergeant Heller in the passenger seat. Both nodded in agreement to check the branch to the Porter house first, as that was the only destination they knew Ethan had been asked to go to. As the patrol car turned onto the dirt road to the Porter property, light dust rose behind the taillights, then settled like thin fog. The two-story Porter house appeared in the darkness, all lights off except a small one on the porch. Ellis stepped out, his feet crunching loudly on the gravel. He knocked, and after a while the door cracked open, revealing Grant Porter with an irritated expression, as if a police visit at this hour was an unacceptable nuisance. Grant leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, his eyes showing clear annoyance. Ellis asked briefly if they had seen Ethan Mercer, and Grant immediately replied that they hadn't heard or seen anything, then emphasized that the whole house was asleep and didn't want to be disturbed. His voice wasn't loud but sharp and cold, as if the police were crossing some invisible boundary. Ellis stayed calm, requesting confirmation if Ethan had come by that evening, but Grant only repeated that they knew nothing at all. With no legal grounds to detain him, Ellis noted the exchange in his book, while Grant closed the door with just enough force to show irritation without being overtly rude. The two officers returned to the car, continuing to sweep the side roads around the Porter property, then expanding to the intersecting roads with Old Ridge Road. They used high-powered flashlights, scanning dense brush and gaps between tree trunks where a vehicle or person could hide. But everything remained as it was at sunset. Silent, no trace of Ethan or his truck. By nearly midnight, after sweeping all priority areas without finding anything unusual, the patrol returned to downtown to report. The sparse streetlights of Logan now made the scene even more silent, and the emptiness of the narrow streets only heightened the unease spreading in everyone involved in the search. Back at the station, Ellis wrote the final lines in the report: "No sighting of Ethan, no vehicle found, no significant signs detected." Then he turned off the light, removed the radio from his shoulder, and glanced through the front window of the police station, where the night sky covered the town with an absolute silence, too complete to feel reassuring. The first night of searching ended, and Logan still had no idea where Ethan was in the darkness thickening around them. The next morning, when the early sunlight still hadn't fully dispelled the mist from the wooden rooftops in Logan, Sheriff Douglas Reed was already at the police station before the old wall clock even struck opening hours. He sat at the head of the meeting table, with the missing persons file opened the night before, and Deputy Ellis's detailed patrol notes spread out. Other officers filed in one by one, carrying hot coffee and faces still weary from a long night, yielding no clues. The room brightened gradually under the fluorescent lights, revealing tense faces trying to stay alert. After a few minutes to settle, Reed started the meeting by asking everyone to review all information gathered overnight. Ellis reported no trace of Ethan or his truck, no suspicious objects, no unusual movement near Old Ridge Road or side roads. Grant Porter was uncooperative but hadn't committed any direct obstruction, severely limiting further progress. Those gaps made the room's atmosphere heavy, and Reed knew that without systematic clear steps, they could easily fall into the same confusion as many previous rural missing persons cases. He stood up, walked to the large map on the wall showing all of Logan's terrain and the surrounding Hocking Hills forest. In a deep but resolute voice, he reconstructed the estimated timeline based on what they definitively knew. Ethan left the shop in the late afternoon, was seen by an acquaintance passing downtown as dusk fell, then vanished after that, right as the sky turned fully dark. No one received a call or message from him, and no reliable witness confirmed seeing him since that moment. This created a prolonged unclear window, during which Ethan could have gone in multiple directions without leaving traces. Reed used a marker to circle 3 key focus areas. First, the low dense forest northeast of Logan connecting to Hocking Hills, with terrain featuring rocky slopes, small caves, and narrow trails where lost people could easily slip or get stuck. Second, the dirt roads leading out of town, especially around Old Ridge Road and the side roads the patrol covered last night but hadn't thoroughly checked. Third, the shallow stream beds running west to south where mud could retain footprints or tire tracks. These were high-probability areas in forested hill disappearances. He explained that since Logan had virtually no security cameras in 1991, they couldn't rely on footage to reconstruct Ethan's movements, and with cell phones not yet common, tracing via communication data was impossible. No GPS, no cell towers for signals. Police had only 2 things to rely on: witness accounts and terrain structure. The officers in the room nodded, well aware of the era's limitations. Many had worked prior missing cases and knew the key step wasn't always technology, but grasping geographic logic and human behavior. Reed pointed to the map, noting the likely route Ethan took if heading to the Porter house, from the machine shop along the main road to downtown, turning into the quiet southern neighborhood, then continuing on the dirt road to the low forest. He directed search teams to focus along these axes, as they were the most logical based on the family's reported destination. Officers assigned to different routes began taking notes, assigning experienced terrain personnel to survey rocky slopes and trails near streams. Ellis added that the last sighting area had many intersections leading into the forest, also where incidents could occur unnoticed due to sparse population. Reed marked that area with a red circle, emphasizing it as the centerpiece of the expanded search that day. He ended the meeting with a straightforward yet determined statement. "We only know Ethan left the shop, appeared once downtown, then no one saw him again. Everything else is roads waiting for us to find answers." The emergency meeting ended in focused silence, and each person left the room with maps, notes, and assignments, carrying the clear sense that today would be the first step in the effort to locate Ethan with everything the Logan police force could muster within the constraints of 1991. As the sun rose high, and the mist gradually cleared from the open lots around Logan, the first search team had fully assembled behind the police station, more than 30 people, including officers, volunteers, and 2 K9 dogs trained to scent missing persons. The morning air carried a mix of urgency and hope, as daylight allowed them to examine areas that the darkness of night had rendered impossible for human eyes. Sheriff Reed stood in front of the group, pointing to a map spread out on the hood of a patrol car, clearly defining the search area. The road connecting the machine shop to the town center, extending to the small neighborhood in the south, and then out to the dirt road leading toward the Porter house. This was the most critical zone, because if Ethan was truly on his way there, he would likely have had to pass through this part of Logan. The search team was divided into 3 large groups. The first group handled along the main road, using visual searches combined with the K9s to scan for any unusual signs on the ground. The second group ventured deeper into the open lots on both sides of the road, where tall weeds grew and could easily retain footprints or tire skid marks. The third group checked the small paths leading into the sparse woods sandwiched between residential areas and low hills, in case Ethan had stopped his vehicle or turned onto one of those side trails. Mornings in Logan were usually quiet, but today they were bustling with the calls of searchers to one another. The sounds of unleashing the pair of K9 set, and the constant crackle of handheld radios updating each group's position. The volunteers wore bright-colored clothing for easy identification, walking slowly across patches of grass, bending down to inspect small depressions or disturbed soil. Officers occasionally crouched low to examine the road surface at eye level, where tire tracks might show more clearly, especially on sections of ground still damp from overnight dew. A few spots looked like fresh tire marks, but after comparing them to the tire patterns of families living in the area, they quickly determined these were just neighbors' vehicles passing through early that morning. The K9s were led along the road's edge, noses pressed close to the ground, sometimes sniffing deeply before veering in another direction, but every seeming discovery led only to residents' walkways or food smells from backyards. The distance from the shop to the southern neighborhood wasn't long, but the breadth of the search made the work slow and meticulous, as overlooking even a small sign could derail the entire effort. They looked for every familiar detail, scraps of fabric that might have fallen from clothing, skid marks on dry ground, bottle caps, wrappers, personal items that a missing person might drop if something went wrong. But that morning, they found nothing beyond harmless items from local residents. An empty soda can, a plastic bag blown by the wind, a piece of rotten wood that vaguely resembled broken plastic but was quickly deemed unrelated. As the group entered the open lots near the town's edge, where grass grew calf-high and the soil was soft, as if recently soaked by rain, they searched more thoroughly, because if Ethan had stopped his vehicle or had an incident here, the ground would retain some sign. Yet the soil only held rows of flattened grass, indicating familiar footpaths used by neighborhood kids or adults cutting through to shorten their way into town. There wasn't a single trace characteristic of a pickup truck like the one Ethan drove. When the sun reached its peak, the light grew harsher and heat began spreading toward the teams. They paused briefly for water, but continued observing each area carefully. A group of young volunteers found faint skid marks on the dirt near a small path, but after two officers compared them to common tire shapes and checked the surrounding dust, they concluded these were old marks from days prior. By noon, the entire area between the shop and the road leading to the Porter house had been thoroughly searched. No clothing scraps, no items, no fresh skid marks, nothing that could link to Ethan. The faces that had started with hope shifted to worry, and even the most optimistic volunteers fell silent as they looked at the stretching road in silence, as if it had never witnessed anything unusual. As the search team gathered their gear to return to the station, one could clearly sense the disappointment spreading with every step, as if everything they had just done only deepened a frightening truth. Daylight made things clearer and easier to search, yet it revealed not even the smallest sign of where Ethan had gone, or what had happened to him since leaving the shop the previous day. After the morning search team returned empty-handed and disheartened, Sheriff Reed decided not to let time slip away uselessly. He immediately deployed forces deeper into the forested area of Hocking Hills, where the terrain was complex and traces might be faint. But it lay on a logical route if Ethan had turned onto one of the less traveled side roads after leaving town. By early afternoon, more than 24 officers and volunteers were deployed into the forest in a grid search pattern, each person spaced evenly apart, moving parallel to ensure no patch of ground, no matter how small, was missed. The groups were divided toward the northeast and southeast, where the forest shifted from sparse to dense, with large tree trunks growing close together and canopies interwoven into a dark layer that even midday light couldn't fully penetrate. Thin mist rose from the mossy carpet underfoot, making the air damp and sticky against the skin and harder to breathe than usual. The K-9 teams led each group, noses constantly touching the ground, then lifting as if trying to separate hundreds of mingled scents in the earth. But Hocking Hills was never friendly to missing person searches, wildlife, hiker footprints, tree sap smells, all blended into a maze of odors that even trained dogs struggled to pinpoint anything noteworthy. Those behind held long sticks to push aside thick brush, peering deep into rock crevices, piles of fallen leaves with unusual shapes, and soft soil patches where traces might remain if someone had passed. But every time they thought they'd found a depression or disturbed earth, closer inspection revealed only animal signs or footprints from previous days. The forest air was so thick that calls of Ethan's name echoed briefly before being swallowed by the canopy above, as if sound could never cross this natural boundary. One group of officers spotted a fallen tree trunk blocking a low slope leading to a rock crevice. For a few seconds they paused to investigate, concerned someone might have fallen there, but there were no scratches, skid marks, or any signs of heavy impact. Everything was too pristine, too clean, heightening the unease. If Ethan had passed here, he surely would have left something. Yet the forest maintained its cold, indifferent calm. In mid-afternoon, the sound of a helicopter from the Ohio State Patrol rose above the treetops. The pilot flew in slow zigzags, thermal cameras scanning below, in hopes of detecting a human figure, a reflective metal object, or anything unnatural. But Hocking Hills was where helicopters always struggled. The dense canopy like layered roofs, large branches interwoven into a perfect shield, revealing only narrow gaps that cameras couldn't penetrate. Despite repeated passes in multiple directions, the images relayed back showed only a sea of deep green leaves and impenetrable dark patches. Reed stood on the ground, eyes following the helicopter in the sky, grateful for the additional support yet bitter, because he knew this place had dragged out many searches for weeks without results. The forest terrain around Logan featured moss-covered rock slopes, steep trails, soft ground sections, and even narrow crevices that could conceal a person without clear signs. Many volunteers had to grip tree trunks or use sticks for balance when descending slippery slopes. One officer nearly slipped when stepping on thick, decayed leaves over rocks, forcing everyone to slow down for safety. Each step crunched the ground, but that also meant any potential traces from Ethan could be obscured by the search team itself if not extremely careful. As evening approached, light filtering through canopy gaps grew slanted and weak, thin golden streaks clinging as if reluctant to leave. Groups began radioing progress reports. The eastern sector cleared, no tire tracks. The southern group checked a deep crevice, but found only broken branches. The western group noted animal signs and many hiker footprints, but nothing related to the missing person. Each report started and ended the same, only adding to the heavy atmosphere spreading among everyone present. When the last light began fading beyond the horizon, Reed had to order withdrawal because Hocking Hills was no place for safe searching after dark. The team regrouped at the rendezvous point, covered in dirt, shirts damp with sweat, canines panting heavily from non-stop activity. They looked at each other, faces unspoken, but everyone knew. Another long day passed without a single clue, not even the faintest sign of where Ethan might have gone. And as they left the forest, leaving only fresh crisscrossing boot prints on the soft ground, Hocking Hills remained cold and silent, as if untouched by any search effort, leaving in each person the feeling of confronting the heaviest silence nature could create. That afternoon, after the search team left Hocking Hills weary and disappointed, Sheriff Douglas Reed decided it was time to return to the only starting point they hadn't fully verified, the Porter family home. If Ethan truly intended to go there the previous afternoon, directly hearing from Rachel Porter, who might be the last lead connected to his movements, was something that could no longer be delayed. Reed drove to the Porter house as the afternoon sun faded, casting long shadows across the front lawn. The two-story house stood still, as if detached from the town's bustle all day, and when Reed knocked, the sound echoed coldly across the wide yard. The door opened after a few seconds, and Grant Porter stepped out first, his eyes unable to hide wariness. He stood just enough to block the view, creating the sense that the house behind was protected from outsiders' gazes. Reed stated his purpose and requested to speak with Rachel. Grant hesitated slightly, but eventually widened the door enough for Rachel to appear behind him, her face somewhat pale from fatigue or indefinable tension. As Reed entered the living room, he noticed the space was very tidy, almost excessively orderly for a family with young children. Items were aligned perfectly, tabletops free of any clutter, all contributing to a cold indifference enveloping the room, as if everything was kept too clean to conceal something. Rachel sat in a single chair, hands clasped together, eyes downcast. Grant didn't sit, but leaned against the doorframe between the living room and kitchen, from where he could observe the entire conversation without intervening. His presence made the room heavy, and Reed clearly sensed that every word from Rachel would be heard verbatim by Grant. The sheriff started with basic questions: whether Rachel had seen Ethan the previous afternoon, whether she received any information about him leaving the shop, or any reason to think he changed direction. Rachel answered briefly, to the point, but extremely limited. She said, in a voice almost choked, that Ethan didn't come, that all afternoon she was busy with the kids and heard no sounds or vehicles stopping in front. Each statement seemed carefully arranged before spoken, and Reed immediately noticed how she avoided his gaze when answering direct questions. "Are you sure you didn't see him?" Reed repeated, keeping his voice calm but slow to observe her facial reaction. She swallowed hard, eyes glancing at Grant before nodding. "No, no one came here yesterday afternoon." The answer was too quick, too concise, and too much like a rehearsed line. Reed sensed it clearly, but he also knew feelings were never enough for evidence. He shifted to smaller details, whether she looked outside as it started getting dark, heard any vehicles passing, or noticed anything unusual in the backyard. Rachel answered no to all, always with a fleeting glance toward Grant, as if checking his reaction. What struck Reed most was her expression whenever Ethan was mentioned, not grief, not confusion, but something like deep inner tension, a fear unspoken but trembling in every breath. When Reed asked if Ethan often visited their home, Rachel only said they rarely met, and there was no reason for him to stop by that day. Grant remained still, arms crossed over his chest, eyes fixed on the conversation. His silent oversight constricted the living room atmosphere, as if no one was allowed to breathe deeper than necessary. Reed tried to create space by walking Rachel through more details, hoping for a small inconsistency, but answers always circled back to the same point. Didn't see Ethan. Didn't hear anything. Didn't know anything. Each response slipped away like water through fingers, impossible to grasp. Yet it was precisely that perfection that made Reed uneasy. An innocent person usually has vague details, imprecise memories, or emotional interjections. But Rachel showed none of that. Everything she said sounded edited, words trimmed to reveal nothing, especially when Reed asked if she was worried about Ethan. Instead of answering immediately, Rachel paused a beat, lips pressed together before saying she hoped everything would be okay. A statement not wrong, but lacking the warmth a familiar person would have. The longer the conversation went, the clearer it became to the sheriff that Grant wasn't just listening. He loomed like a large shadow over Rachel's responses. When Reed asked a few more about her whereabouts in the house the previous afternoon, Grant muttered something like a reminder too low for Reed to catch, but enough for Rachel to tighten her grip, shoulders slightly hunching. That made the unease surface like a ripple on an apparently calm lake. When the interview ended, Reed stood, thanked Rachel for cooperating, and Grant saw him to the door with an inscrutable, twisted smile. The door closed behind Reed without a loud sound, but it echoed in his mind like a bigger question mark than any answer he'd received that day. He had no evidence, no traces, no directly contradictory statements to rely on, but the sense of abnormality creeping in didn't diminish at all. It wasn't something he could write in a report, but it was strong enough to slow his steps on the stone path in front of the Porter house as he looked up at the darkening sky and wondered if inside that house there was something he hadn't seen. But for now, all he had was a sparse interview and an unfounded hunch. A hunch that made him feel Logan, usually peaceful, was beginning to shift in the most unpredictable way. As he left the evasive interview in the Porter's living room, Sheriff Reed did not head straight back to the station, but decided to take the next step in his duties, a thorough survey of the entire area surrounding the house, something the law allowed him to do without a search warrant. This was not unusual in missing persons cases, but today, the pent-up tension and unease from Rachel's demeanor, and the way Grant had overseen the entire conversation, made Reed pay particular attention to every detail. He returned to his vehicle, exchanged a few words with Deputy Ellis, and then the two of them got out and began circling the Porter property with professional, serious gestures that were not confrontational. The house sat on a plot of land much larger than those in the residential areas of Logan. The lawn was mowed too evenly, the wooden fence along the side showed no rotting sections, and the backyard was partially shaded by large maple trees that provided cooling shade, making the place look both tidy and isolated in a way that was hard to explain. Reed noticed the near-absolute silence of the area. No children's chatter. No smells of cooking wafting from the kitchen door. Only the light wind rustling through the leaves and the sound of their footsteps crunching on the thin layer of soil. Ellis used a small flashlight to shine into the gaps between the exterior siding boards, looking for cracks or unusual peeling paint, but everything was unbelievably smooth, with no signs of violence, impact, or hasty repairs. Reed bent down to check the back porch, a long wooden step leading to the backyard covered by a small overhang. He knelt low to look underneath the step, where in many cases, people inadvertently dropped something, but aside from a few dry leaves and old cobwebs, there was nothing suspicious. A sparrow flew up from the bushes, startling Ellis for a second, and then the two continued along the edge of the house. They closely examined the area next to the garage, where the ground was hard from frequent vehicle traffic. But today it was so clean that there were no tire tracks visible, except the most recent ones made by the Porters themselves. Older traces seemed to have faded or been erased very evenly, as if the yard had been swept recently, but not unusually enough to draw any conclusions. As they moved to the backyard, Grant Porter appeared from the back porch with a glass of water in hand and stood there as if he had anticipated this move. He did not approach, did not ask what they were doing, just stood there, eyes following their every step. Grant's gaze was not exactly threatening, but there was something deeply etched in that observation, like a reminder that they were on his property, and every action was being noted. This made Reed's survey even more tense, but he maintained his calm demeanor and continued scanning the yard. The backyard was spacious but sparsely furnished, an old swing set, a weathered wooden outdoor dining table, a few planters placed against the wall. There were no children's toys scattered around like in other homes in town, a detail that surprised Reed, since he knew the Porters had young children. Ellis walked to the area near the eastern fence, where the soil was softer due to shade. He used a stick to gently flip over some layers of dry leaves to see if anything was hidden underneath, but it was all just pebbles and tree roots. Reed checked the ground near the air conditioning unit, where many families tend to place miscellaneous items without thinking, but here there was only fine dust evenly covering it, with no drag marks or impressions from heavy objects. Everything was too neat, too clean, and that made him more uncomfortable than finding a vague clue would have. As they circled behind the garage, Grant followed a few meters back, maintaining distance but close enough for Ellis to feel the clear pressure of his presence. He said nothing, but his look seemed to ask, "What else are you planning to check?" Reed paused to look directly at the backyard, trying to memorize every contour of the land. A perfect yard is not always suspicious, but in this context, that perfection did not bring reassurance. It was like a room cleaned too thoroughly right after something had happened. However, suspicion cannot become evidence, and Reed knew the law kept him within very tight boundaries. He could not enter the house without probable cause, could not demand to inspect the garage just based on a feeling, and could not dig up the backyard without clear signs of criminal activity. Ellis checked the wall edge where the water pipe ran down, as this was a spot that could easily show impact marks if a conflict had occurred near the door. But he shook his head to indicate nothing unusual. No dried blood, no objects dented into the wall, no fragments however small. Reed approached the wooden fence at the end of the yard, lightly gripping one of the boards to test its sturdiness. The wood was old but solid, with no signs of being pried apart and nailed back, which is often seen if someone tried to drag something over the fence. He turned to Ellis, and with just a glance, both understood they would have to end the survey without gaining anything. No physical evidence, no traces, no reason to expand their boundaries further. Grant, as if sensing that moment, took one more step out onto the porch. "Done yet?" he asked in an even tone, neither mocking nor friendly. Reed replied with the required courtesy, "We're just following procedure. If we get new information, we'll be back." Grant merely nodded, saying nothing more. As they left the Porter property, Reed looked back one last time. The late afternoon light cast a pale yellow over the lawn, making everything appear overly peaceful. But in his eyes, that peace seemed more like a facade than the true nature. He knew he had nothing in hand, knew he could not take another step, but that did not dispel the feeling that this land was still hiding something. With a missing man, an overly calm statement, a house too clean, and a homeowner too guarded, what he saw around the Porter home provided no answers, but left him with a bigger question than any evidence could. If nothing really happened here, why did everything feel like it had been prepared so carefully to say nothing? As the survey around the Porter home concluded, without yielding any clear signs, Sheriff Reed decided to redirect all efforts to another direction, filling in the time gap between the moment Ethan was last seen in the town center and the point when he completely vanished as night fell. That was the most ambiguous period, and the only key Reed could rely on at the moment. The next morning, he instructed officers to fan out into the neighborhoods around Main Street, where acquaintances had seen Ethan's truck pass by the previous afternoon. They went door to door, starting with homes that had views of the main road, then spreading to those near the turn leading south out of town. Logan was small, but the slow pace of daily life meant residents often did not notice movements around them, and this became evident right from the initial statements. Most said they had not noticed anyone passing at that time. As in the late afternoon, some were preparing dinner, others were still out in the fields, and some were watching the news. However, amid those ordinary responses, a few small pieces of information began to emerge, not clear enough to be leads, but impossible to ignore. An elderly woman living near the hardware store said she remembered seeing a dark-colored pickup truck drive by at a slower speed than usual. When police asked if she was sure it was Ethan's truck, she just shook her head. "I didn't see clearly. I saw the truck but not the person." That was the kind of statement that gave Reed both hope and caution, because dark-colored pickups were the most common vehicles in Logan. Nearly every household had one. Another person in the southern neighborhood vaguely remembered a similar truck, this time from behind as she was watering plants in her yard. "I saw the taillights flash, and then it disappeared around the turn," she said. "But I'm not sure. Who knows? Everyone drives like that around here." Such statements appeared more frequently as police moved deeper into the southern part of town. An older man living near the intersection of the main road and a small road leading to Old Ridge Road said he heard an engine sound that seemed heavy around the time it was just getting dark. But when pressed for more details, he chuckled and said the neighbor's truck made a similar noise and he could not be certain. Responses like that were not useless, but lacked the reliability to piece together a clear timeline. Still, police carefully marked each account on a map, creating a band of blurry points, places where the truck might have appeared. What caught Reed's attention most was not the trucks that were seen or heard, but a different story from a boy about 10 years old, living with his family near the southeastern edge of town by the forest. When asked if he had seen anything unusual the previous afternoon, he answered quite naturally that he was riding his bike near the fence when he heard something like wood slamming hard or something falling to the ground, coming from the direction of the dirt road leading into the lower forest area. His mother immediately interjected, apologizing for her son's imagination, adding that the sound could have been someone closing a truck bed or a tree branch breaking. Reed did not impose his own interpretation on this account, as children often describe sounds differently from adults, but he still noted it down, because the direction the boy pointed matched the route Ethan might have taken if he had left the main road. A family living near the southern intersection also mentioned hearing dogs barking longer than usual around the time it was just getting dark, but when they went to check, they saw no one. They thought it might just be wildlife coming close to the yard, as summer was when black bears and deer moved around a lot. But Reed still marked it, though, without high expectations. Sound-based clues were always the hardest to verify, because in mountainous forest towns, sounds could echo from very far away. As officers continued questioning more households, similar stories began to emerge: strange noises, lights flashing by, shadows of vehicles speeding in the dusk. All could be coincidences. All could be unrelated. But all occurred within the time frame when Ethan disappeared. A man living near the turn toward the Porters said he thought he saw a truck parked on the side of the road, but when trying to recall, he admitted he could not say exactly which day it was, because trucks are parked there every night. Police could not use such vague accounts for anything specific, but they still recorded it and marked the area the man indicated. Another witness, who worked at the convenience store near the center, remembered that afternoon being busy with customers, and she was completely unsure if she had seen anything beyond hearing others coming in and out talking about the hot weather. When police asked if she remembered any particular truck passing, she shook her head. "I didn't notice, I'm sorry." It was hard to blame anyone, because no one had reason to remember a pickup truck driving by on a normal summer afternoon before they knew the driver was missing. Reed compiled all the statements into an information board. The dots on the map began to appear like scattered stars, not in a line, not in a chain, not tightly connected. Each faint account acted like a shard of broken mirror, reflecting differently on what might have happened. But none was large enough to see the full picture. And most importantly, no witness could confirm they had definitely seen Ethan. Just a truck similar to Ethan's. Heard a sound that might be related. Saw lights that might belong to him. All covered in a thick fog of ambiguity, of uncertain memories, of details that might be accurate or completely unrelated to the disappearance. As the sun climbed higher and police began wrapping up the witness canvassing, Reed stood before the map with its array of noted dots and realized that what they had was just a series of disconnected points, unable to be arranged into any clear logic. Even as the number of statements increased, the information diluted, failing to create a breakthrough. Logan was a town where people usually remembered faces, but not much about what they saw on the road. With Ethan's disappearance, that became the biggest obstacle. All they had gathered from the area between the town center and the turn toward the Porters was accounts lingering in the stifling afternoon, a truck of uncertain ownership, a sound from an unknown source, a fleeting sense that something had happened, but all insufficient to move the case forward, even a small step. The time gaps remained as they were, wide, dark, and without any foothold. And that was what made Reed feel that Logan, though small and familiar, was becoming a more tangled maze than he had ever thought. The second day of the search began with a completely different atmosphere. Instead of just a few dozen people, the area behind the Logan Sheriff Station was so crowded that patrol vehicles had to back up against the wall to make room. News that Ethan had still not been found after a full day of searching spread quickly through the community, and this morning the number of volunteers had doubled. There were farmers who left their fieldwork unfinished, teachers who took the day off, a group of young people with flashlights and backpacks of water, even elderly folks with canes, insisting on joining. Everyone said Logan had never had a disappearance serious enough to nearly bring the town to a standstill like this. Sheriff Reed looked at the crowd before him, knowing that greater manpower meant they could expand the search to areas they had not reached yesterday. He began reassigning groups, this time prioritizing terrain different from the deep forest, avoiding repetition of the effort that had consumed the entire previous day. One group was sent to the dry creek beds running around and through Logan. Summer creeks were often just strips of dry gravel with thin streams of water, but they preserved traces well if anyone had passed through. Rocks could be displaced, mud along the banks could retain footprints, and someone falling into a creek would not be able to hide much. This group of about 10 people moved along the creek beds, bending over to observe each remaining patch of damp soil under shaded areas. They looked for footprints, drag marks, scraps of fabric, or any object that might have been carried by the water and caught between small rock formations. But there were only a few rotting leaves, broken branches, and scattered old footprints from fishermen the previous week. 2 canine dogs sniffed continuously along the flow direction, but only reacted to animal scents and wild grass. When the group turned to a section of creek almost completely shaded by tree canopy, a few stopped to check small rock hollows under the banks, but everything remained clean. The second group was taken to natural rock ledges, not far from town, where layers of sandstone formed gentle slopes smoothed over time. These areas were often where kids gathered to play or adults stood to admire the forest, but they could also cause someone to slip if passing in the dark. This group searched along each rock level, closely examining crevices between rocks and weeds. They checked the small deep grooves where tree roots ran down, because if someone had stumbled, slide marks would remain on the thin soil covering the rock face. But all were just natural erosion lines from rainwater. One officer even climbed a higher outcrop for an overview, but from above, there was only dense green forest, no unusual traces. The third group headed to Logan's old dump site, where residents used to bring discarded items before the town switched to a new collection system. The area stretched over uneven ground with both old and new debris, rusted cans, broken wood pieces, plastic bags weighed down by rubble, even large items like broken chairs or rotted cabinets. This was an ideal location in many missing persons cases because trash could cover traces without anyone noticing. Volunteers and officers used long sticks to push aside layers, patiently checking each pile, but the only things they found were the town's trash. a cracked tire, a bag of broken toys, a few old beer cans, and a torn raincoat not belonging to Ethan. No fabric scraps matching the clothes he wore, no personal items that made them pause longer than a few seconds. The soft soil areas around the dump were also thoroughly checked, but there were no notable new tire tracks or footprints. In addition to the terrain search groups, another team of officers was tasked with meeting Ethan's close acquaintances to better understand his behavior. They visited the Mercer home again, then met his friends and coworkers at the auto shop. But the most important conversation occurred when they reached April, Ethan's girlfriend, who likely understood him better than anyone. April received them in the small living room of the house she shared with her sister. This was the first time since the previous day that she could speak with police after recovering from the initial shock. Though her eyes were still red and swollen, her voice was calmer, only trembling slightly when mentioning Ethan. April said Ethan would never disappear without a word like this. He was responsible, especially toward his son, and always informed others of even minor plan changes. He hated making people worry, especially his mother and April. When describing Ethan's personality, April portrayed him as cautious, not liking unfamiliar roads unless necessary, and almost never turning onto dirt roads or remote areas without a clear reason. He was not the type to seek adventure or challenges. This caught the police's attention because it did not align with Ethan voluntarily going deep into the forest the previous night. If he left the main road, it might have been the result of a sudden event, not a natural choice. April emphasized that Ethan was simple, introverted, preferred familiarity, and had no history of sudden departures. She added that he had serious plans for the future, even mentioning marriage proposals. All this made the possibility of him leaving on his own seem absurd. Police noted every detail from April as it painted a clear behavioral pattern. Ethan followed principles, was responsible, and deeply loved his family. Someone like that was highly unlikely to disappear voluntarily, and even less likely to turn onto dangerous or secluded roads. This information reinforced Reed's belief that the dry creeks, rock ledges, and dump site, places where unexpected accidents could occur, were the right focus for today's search. As the sun shifted to the golden light of late afternoon, all search groups gradually returned to the sheriff's station. Many had mud-stained clothes, sleeves wet from wading creeks or dusty from the dump. But the atmosphere sank with the same disappointment as the day before. No physical evidence belonging to Ethan, no new footprints, no clothing, no personal items, nothing indicating he had passed through the places they had turned upside down all day. More participants, wider coverage, but results still shrouded the entire town in darkness. The second night fell over Logan, in the silence of those who had tried but advanced, not even one step closer. A leaf falling on the road said nothing. A displaced stone was not a sign leading to Ethan. And Reed, standing on the station steps watching people disperse into the night, felt more clearly than ever that this disappearance was unlike previous ones. It was not simply someone lost or in an accident, it was an invisible void that no amount of effort could fill. Logan was beginning to sense the presence of something lurking out of sight, quietly moving over the past 2 days like a shadow yet to be named. That unease had just taken root, when news of the vehicle being discovered suddenly arrived as the sun was tilting toward the west, when the last search groups of the second day were leaving the dry creek and rocky banks, heading back to town with disappointed faces covered in dust. A volunteer who lived near the edge of Logan, on his way driving home to his farm, spotted something that didn't belong in the familiar landscape. A charcoal-colored pickup truck, sitting quietly in a remote clearing, used as a turnaround spot for anglers around Old Man's Cave. The road leading into that clearing was narrow and rough, flanked by overgrown bushes, so no one had any reason to go in there unless they wanted to pull over to rest or check a map. The man, having closely followed the search news for 2 days, immediately recognized the familiar shape of the truck. As he approached, his heart beat harder with each step, and when he clearly saw the license plate, there was no doubt left. It was Ethan Mercer's truck. He quickly backed away to his own vehicle, started the engine, and called the police right away. His voice trembling with both fear and relief, at the thought that they had finally found a real lead. Sheriff Reed and a group of officers arrived immediately, patrol cars racing over the dirt roads as if every minute was being snatched from their hands. When they got there, the sight before them made Reed pause for a beat. The truck sat silent, strangely clean, as if it had just been placed there rather than abandoned after an incident. No doors were flung open, no signs of a struggle around it. The ground wasn't disturbed. Even the grass along the edge of the clearing was intact, without the usual drag marks if someone had tried to move something heavy. Yesterday's search team had passed through the nearby area, but hadn't turned into this remote clearing, and Reed understood why. From the main road looking in, it appeared like just an ordinary gravel patch, partially obscured by thick bushes. Only when someone stood at the right angle, or entered the exact narrow path, did the truck reveal itself. Reed approached closer, his palms unconsciously clenching. He looked at the truck as if it were a message left in the woods from an unknown sender. An officer used a flashlight to shine through the exterior glass, even though it was still light, looking for signs of scattered items or mess, but saw nothing unusual. Inside the truck looked neat, the driver's seat adjusted to Ethan's usual position, the dashboard undamaged, windows intact, no visible blood or obvious disturbance from outside. Another officer checked the ground around the tires. No skid marks, no deep footprints, no signs the truck had stopped abruptly or turned sharply. Everything was too quiet, too pristine, making the unease even greater. If Ethan had driven it here himself, why would he abandon it without leaving any trace? And if someone else brought the truck here, how could they have left without leaving signs? Reed ordered everyone not to open the doors. "Don't touch anything," he instructed, his voice so stern that a few nearby people held their breath for a moment. In missing persons cases, the vehicle is often the most important clue, but also the easiest to destroy its value if someone touches it wrong. Reed knew that 1991 forensics weren't advanced, but the scene still had to be preserved, so any remaining signs wouldn't be erased by haste. He circled the truck once more, slowly, like someone reading a story written in a language he wasn't fluent in. No mud caked under the chassis, indicating it hadn't been driven into the creek or soft ground. No leaves caught in the wheels, showing it hadn't plunged through thick brush. No broken mirror shards, no major scratches, no signs of collision. As if the truck had traveled on smooth roads, stopped normally, and the driver had simply left. But to where and why? A gust of wind swept through, rustling the branches overhead, bringing a chill that made Reed shiver. He ran his hand along the edge of the driver's door, without touching the surface, looking close enough to confirm nothing was visible. No fingernail marks, no scratches, no fresh scuffs. The scene was so clean that the cleanliness itself became the most abnormal thing. Ellis noted in his log that the location was far enough from the main road that no one would naturally see the truck looking in, but not quite the spot someone wanting to hide a vehicle would choose. This made placing the truck here intentional, but not fitting any clear behavioral pattern. After securing the surrounding area, Reed called for a tow truck to take the vehicle to the station. He stood a few meters away, watching the truck being hooked up and pulled out of where it had sat for hours unknown to anyone. As it rolled through the narrow dirt path, the officers stood aside along the edge, watching with heavy eyes. To them, the truck wasn't just an inanimate object, it was the only part of Ethan still present, the last thing that could tell the story of that day, even as everything else remained silent. Reed walked last, eyes on the tow truck's tire tracks imprinted on the thin soil where the truck had been. He knew they hadn't discovered anything inside yet, but he also knew its appearance opened a completely new investigative direction, a big question they had no answer for. Ethan left town in this truck, but the reason it ended up here, far from everything, not on any route he usually took, was pulling the disappearance into a new realm of darkness. And in that darkness, the truck didn't give them answers, only another mystery. News of Ethan's truck being found spread throughout Logan in just a few hours, as if someone had flipped a switch igniting an electric current running along every road in town. No one had seen the truck firsthand, but everyone talked about it at the grocery store near the square, in the church pews, in the high school parking lot, at the diner where locals often sat for morning coffee. Logan wasn't a place with much upheaval, and when a disappearance stretching 2 straight days gained a new baffling detail, rumors became the town's way of explaining what they couldn't control. People whispered in the aisles of the general store that finding the truck means they'll find him soon, but their eyes stayed fixed on the ground, as if they didn't believe their own words. Alongside those fragile, hopeful consolations, darker rumors began slipping into conversations among quite a few. The Porter family became the most mentioned topic, because even without evidence, Rachel's strange reticence and Grant's irritated attitude when police visited the day before had planted unspoken questions in the townspeople's minds. A group at the coffee shop near the center recounted that Grant had a hot temper, always acting annoyed with Ethan in the times they'd crossed paths in the farm supply area. Others said they'd never seen Rachel act friendly, and that family is too secretive. But even in those malicious rumors, no one dared say outright that they thought the Porters were involved in the disappearance. Logan was a small town. Any slander could cause rifts lasting years. Yet the suspicion still quietly clung to them, like morning fog seeping through the dirt hills and lingering, not fully dissipating even as the sun rose high. Conversely, some others believed Ethan wasn't a victim of anything bad, but had simply chosen to leave, a choice that to them wasn't hard to understand if he was stressed or feeling trapped. They mentioned Ethan working 2 jobs at once, the pressure of caring for his mother and son, plus the turbulent relationship with Rachel and minor rumors about past disputes. Those believing this theory said maybe Ethan wanted to leave town for a while to think, or was fed up with Logan to the point of disappearing for a few days to clear his head. But when those words were spoken, they still looked around as if afraid someone might overhear, because even in that speculation, no one believed Ethan was the type to abandon his son or family without a word. The mutual suspicion put the town in a simmering, tense atmosphere. Most residents wanted to help the search, but each carried a different theory, a different worry, and sometimes even different fears about what might have happened. When news of the truck emerged, many felt like a fragile layer of protection had just crumbled. If the truck was found in such a remote spot, then where was Ethan, and why no signs around it? Those questions left their minds hanging in unease, and any answer led to a hard-to-swallow scenario. For the Mercer family, news of the truck being found didn't bring the relief everyone imagined. Linda Mercer, upon hearing the police notification, felt like her legs could no longer hold her up. She leaned her hand on the armrest, eyes staring at the wall without really seeing anything. She wanted to believe finding the truck meant soon finding Ethan, but the emptiness in the officer's voice when saying, "We haven't found anything inside," made that fragile hope flicker. She remembered the dinners her son used to share, his laughter, the way Ethan always asked if she needed anything before heading to work. The thought that the familiar truck was found without Ethan made her heart contract like falling into emptiness. Cody, Ethan's brother, reacted differently. He became agitated, pacing constantly in the house, fists clenched white. If he left the truck there, someone must have picked him up, he muttered, as if reminding himself to believe the most logical thing amid the swirl of illogical ones in his head. He blamed the police for not doing enough, blamed the town for not helping enough, but deep down, Cody knew what he was angriest about was his own helplessness. As for April, upon hearing the truck was found, she stood silent for a long while, hand clutching the necklace Ethan had given her. She tried to picture Ethan leaving the truck there, a desolate clearing, far from everything familiar, and in her mind, only a choking pain emerged. Ethan wasn't the type to walk into remote areas at dusk. He hated feeling detached from familiar spaces. If the truck was there, Ethan hadn't left it by his own choice. That thought brought tears streaming down, not from despair, but from the sense that something very wrong had happened, and she didn't know where to start looking for answers. Meanwhile, Logan began drawing invisible threads of tension between families, between stories exchanged over fences, between glances meeting on the street. No one wanted to believe something bad was happening in their town, but no one could explain why Ethan's truck was there, intact and silent, like a reminder that something had been torn from Logan's ordinarily peaceful life. And while people continued talking about the Porter family, about the possibility Ethan left on his own, or even wilder theories, only one thing was certain. This small town was no longer as peaceful as before. The unease had crept into every door, every porch, every exchanged look between people who thought they knew everyone around them well. But the truth, at that time for Logan, had only begun to reveal a very small part, and that small part was enough to shake the town. The next day, as the atmosphere of unease in Logan still hung thick like fog, not yet lifted from the dirt hills, Sheriff Reed decided to expand the search to the more remote trails, paths that most Logan residents never set foot on, except for a few experienced hikers or seasoned hunters. These were routes not in the deep forest range swept the first day, but a network of trails weaving between low hills, connecting sparse woods to small valleys and dried-up underground streams. They crisscrossed like tree roots clinging to the terrain, hard to track, but places one could accidentally wander into if turning wrong from the main dirt road. Reed knew that if Ethan had an accident leaving the truck, or if someone forced him off the main path, these trails might hold clues. So, as morning light just sufficiently pierced the treetops, the search team set out again, this time with large topographic maps spread on the patrol car hood. These maps were old, paper yellowed with age, provided by the county park agency, marking elevations, trails, valleys, and little-known natural paths. Officers and volunteers gathered around, pointing to the winding areas like veins flowing around Logan. They coordinated to avoid missing any trail. The first group was taken to the trails heading southeast, where the terrain wasn't steep but stretched along narrow rock ledges, enough to disorient an unfamiliar person in minutes. They walked in lines, checking the ground for fresh footprints, bike tracks, slide marks, or anything differing from nature. But the fine soil mixed with fallen leaves seemed to record no movement beyond animals. There were a few small depressions, but when followed, they belonged to the familiar deer often crossing these trails, nothing human-related. The second group moved north, to old trails once used by local hunters years ago, but now abandoned and nearly vanished under wild grass. To pass here, they had to use machetes to cut back low bushes, reopening paths sealed by time. These trails were dangerous because they could cause slips down subtle slopes, hard for the eye to spot. But despite searching every meter of ground, examining every uprooted root or broken branch, there were no signs an adult had passed here in the last 2 days. Broken branches were too high for human reach, indicating wildlife. Scratches on the soil were old and dry, not fresh enough to relate to Ethan. The third group was sent to southwest Logan, where trails only appeared in the rainy season from water carving paths through dirt slopes. Though now summer and mostly dry, these paths still left unusually winding shapes on the terrain. The search team had to step extremely carefully because the ground was uneven and could give way to underground water. Canine units were brought to sniff for any lingering human scent, but the dogs only reacted to squirrel nests or rabbit burrows. One officer waded into a low dirt pit and shouted Ethan's name loudly, the echo returning so weakly it was nearly swallowed by the forest, answered only by nature's persistent silence. After more than 3 hours of continuous searching, they reached a small clearing that looked like a spot someone had camped years ago. Fallen leaves and rotten wood mixed in the soil, but no personal items, no fresh fire signs, no cans or wrappers, things a lost person often leaves to mark their way. The area was naturally clean, showing no indication anyone had stopped recently. The final group was sent to narrow gaps between rock ledges where seasonal creek water once rushed. These stone crevices formed deep grooves, enough to conceal a person if they fell in, but dangerous to climb down without gear. Officers used safety ropes, slowly lowering themselves into each crevice to shine lights. Below was only old mud, a few horizontal rotten logs, and rain-smoothed rock fragments. They looked for shoe prints, but all they saw was smooth soil. One officer picked up a sharply broken stick and examined it, but it was just a branch fallen from above, showing nothing related to Ethan. By noon, as the sun began glaring on the hillsides, the groups paused for a quick meal and updates. All shared the same report: no physical traces, no fresh footprints, no tire marks, no fabric scraps, no personal items, no signs of walking or running through. The trails expanded today were wider, stranger, far more remote than those near town, yet still yielded not the smallest sign. Throughout the afternoon, the teams continued sweeping the remaining marked trails. They climbed slopes, descended, followed rock edges, crossed sparse woods, and knee-high grassy areas. Each repeated the process: scrutinized the ground, checked displaced leaf patches, examined rock crevices, listened for unusual sounds. But every time they thought they'd found something, a slide mark, a sunken patch, a branch snap, it ultimately returned nature's only answer: no. As the sky shifted to the soft light of late afternoon, the entire team had nearly covered all accessible trails. No one said it aloud, but all felt a disappointment flowing like cold water. The expanded area today was far larger than the initial search, but that vastness only made the void around Ethan's disappearance deeper. Back at the rally point, Reed looked at the map with dozens of completed marks and saw only empty spaces, places searched but yielding nothing. No physical evidence, no anomalies, not a single pointer connecting the disappearance to any direction. And as the sun gradually set, its last light hitting distant treetops, everyone knew that today's efforts, no matter how persistent, hadn't brought them one step closer to finding Ethan. Logan, once again, ended a long day in prolonged unease like a shadow with no end. The first weekend passed in a heaviness that the entire town of Logan could feel. And when Sheriff Reed looked back at the topographic map covered in circles, crossouts, and dense notes left by the search teams, he realized a painful truth. After 7 days of continuous searching, the town was still completely empty-handed. Not a single clue led to Ethan. No footprints, no belongings, no physical signs of an accident, no witness clear enough to build an investigative direction. All they had were scattered points, vague statements, shadows of speculation that couldn't be pinned to anything solid. The volunteers were exhausted by the 5th day. Many still showed up, but their eyes had lost the initial hope, replaced by confusion and fear in the face of the unusual silence surrounding the disappearance. On the 7th day, even the police team began to feel an unnamed unease. They were used to finding lost people quickly, often within hours or a day, but this one had dragged on far too long without leaving any trace. As if Ethan had evaporated into thin air. Reed sat in his office at the end of the day, the dim yellow light from his desk lamp shining on thick stacks of reports that contained no progress. He flipped through the pages over and over, hoping to find something overlooked, but everything had already been thoroughly checked. Statements from residents around the town center, search results from the main road, sparse forest areas, dry creeks, rocky banks, the dump, and even the remote trails, all marked "nothing found." That was the phrase he hated most, because it repeated like the empty echo of failure. And in that silence, a thought began to form in his mind. A thought he had tried to push away several times in the previous days, but now it was so clear he could no longer deny it. Something unnatural was happening. A person like Ethan, with his cautious nature and clear habits, wouldn't vanish in the middle of his own town without leaving a trace. A person wouldn't voluntarily abandon his car in a remote spot and walk into indefinite darkness without a reasonable motive. Reed sat up straight, hands clasped together, the heaviness in his chest no longer just fatigue. He began to suspect that this was no longer a simple missing person case. Foul play, external intervention, was something he didn't want to consider. But the more he pushed it away, the stronger it came back. If something bad had happened to Ethan, someone had to know. And if someone knew, that person was staying silent. He remembered Rachel's demeanor, evasive, unusually short answers, hands clasped tightly in tension. He remembered Grant's cold, wary gaze, the way he stood throughout the interview, as if guarding his wife's every breath. But Reed still had to remind himself that suspicion was not evidence. No blood, no physical signs, no witnesses to conflict, no screams, nothing to accuse anyone. What he felt was only intuition, and intuition wasn't enough to get a search warrant or open a formal criminal investigation. Meanwhile, the media began to slow down after the initial days of constant coverage. The local newspaper had run 3 articles about the disappearance, but the content had become repetitive. No new developments. Police continue searching. Town worried. There was nothing else for them to write. The radio station only repeated Ethan's description and calls for assistance, but the announcer's voice gradually became monotonous, losing the initial urgency. Areas around Logan began to treat the case as minor news, no longer paying attention. That was what Reed noticed most clearly. Fading interest meant the pressure to search fell entirely on him and the officers of the small town, and that pressure exhausted him even more, because he knew everyone was waiting for answers from him, but he had none to give. The Mercer family fell into despair. Linda no longer left the house, always sitting near the phone as if afraid to miss any call. April visited every day, bringing faint hope that someone would knock with news. Cody tried to act strong, but Reed had seen the empty look in the boy's eyes as he stood on the porch, staring toward the road where Ethan used to drive. 1 week had passed, and Logan had not only lost a person, they had lost their sense of safety, their belief that if something happened, they would notice. Reed stood up, walked out of his office, and looked through the window toward the hills where the searches had taken place countless times that week. The sky darkened, and the treetops were just black outlines casting shadows over the town. He knew they would continue tomorrow, and the day after, but deep down, he already understood a truth he didn't want to tell anyone. The first week ended without a single clue, and that had never been a good sign in any missing person case he'd been involved in. Logan was facing something bigger than a disappearance, something darker, more elusive, ready to drag the town into a long shadow they were unprepared to face. At the Logan police station, Ethan's car sat in the garage out back, where the white neon lights cast down on a thin layer of dust covering the hood like an unwanted frost. This was the first time the forensics team could access the vehicle under controlled conditions, and though 1991 forensics technology was very limited, Sheriff Reed hoped they could at least find something, a small trace, an overlooked detail, anything to open a new direction. But when technician Marvin Holloway arrived, he brought the characteristic caution of someone who understood the limits of his job. Holloway was the county's most veteran technician, having processed hundreds of abandoned vehicles, but as soon as he pulled on his rubber gloves and looked at the car sitting motionless like a forgotten toy in the corner of a yard, he knew it would be a long day. The first thing he did was visually inspect the exterior, the simplest but most essential tool of forensics at the time. He bent down to the front bumper, eyes scanning every millimeter for scratches to check for collision or drag marks. But the paint was intact. Only a few dust streaks and dried dirt patches, likely from driving on dirt roads before it was abandoned. No long skid marks, no peeling paint chips, no signs the car had been forced to stop. Everything indicated it had been parked normally. Then he moved to the tires, especially the tread patterns. If the car had been tampered with, towed, or redirected by someone else, there would often be uneven dirt buildup or unusual friction marks. But Ethan's 4 tires only had a thin layer of dust, neither fresh nor old, revealing almost nothing. Holloway noted the results on his clipboard, but couldn't hide the growing disappointment in his eyes. He turned to the driver's side door, using black powder to check for fingerprints. In 1991, fingerprint collection relied solely on powder and brushes, with no advanced analysis technology. He sprinkled a thin layer of powder on the door edge, gently swirling the brush to adhere to any remaining finger oils. But the powder only formed meaningless smudges, partly because sun, wind, and dust had erased most traces, and partly because the surface hadn't retained any clear prints. He continued on the door handle, then the window edge and rear door trim, but the results were the same: scattered smudges, not clear enough to use. When Holloway entered the interior, he placed a paper liner under the seats to catch any small items that might fall out. though he knew the chances of finding real evidence were very low. The inside was still tidy as when it was found. Gear shift in park, no keys in the ignition, driver's seat adjusted to Ethan's usual position. He checked the dashboard for signs of tampering or obstruction, but everything was normal. The glove compartment held only a few old receipts, nothing relevant. When he bent down to look at the floor mats, the only things visible were a few small dried dirt particles and a thin leaf stuck to the mat edge. But that could have fallen in at any time, not attributable to the disappearance. Still, he carefully used tweezers to place the leaf in an evidence bag, because even low-value items needed to be preserved. When checking the passenger and rear seats, Holloway paused longer, hoping to find signs of foreign objects stuffed in or forgotten items, but under the seats was empty. He shone a flashlight into every narrow crevice, seat edge, and floor section, still just a chilling cleanliness. What puzzled him most was a very thin scratch on the passenger door handle, about an inch long. He leaned in close, using a magnifying glass to examine it. But the scratch was old, edges worn by weather, definitely not new, and certainly unrelated to the disappearance. This disappointed him even more. When moving to the trunk, Holloway stood still for a few seconds before opening it. The trunk of an abandoned car was always the place of greatest hope, but also greatest disappointment. With gloves ready, he opened it. A smooth, empty, cold space appeared. No discarded bags, no strange objects, no rope, no cloth scraps, no open toolbox, just old carpet lining and a bit of dust on the edges. No odd smells, no sticky marks, no forensically valuable items. He shone the light closely into the trunk corners. Every carpet fold, especially the side crevices where small items easily fall. But what he found was only a few dirt particles mixed with dry straw. Nothing indicating Ethan had ever kept anything in the trunk or that something unusual happened there. Holloway sighed, a long sigh that slightly fogged his glasses. Reed stood outside the car, quietly observing every move of the technician, and though he hadn't heard the official report yet, he already knew there would be no progress. When Holloway stepped out of the car and removed his gloves, he just shook his head slightly, in the way of someone who didn't want to say outright that he found nothing. No blood, no strange fibers, no foreign objects, no usable fingerprints, Holloway said in a flat voice, because it was a sentence he'd had to say many times in his career. The car is too clean, too normal. Reed looked at the car one more time, a feeling of frustration rising like standing before a locked door without a key. 1991 forensics could only go this far. Visual observation, powder prints, scratch checks, flashlight searches, small item collection, but no DNA technology, no advanced contact trace analysis, no modern chemical scans. If the car didn't tell its story through clear signs, no one could force it to speak. And today, Ethan Mercer's car had remained absolutely silent. Reed understood that this wasn't just a technical failure. It was a sign that the disappearance was entering a much deeper darkness than what he was prepared to face. After hearing the final report from Technician Holloway, Sheriff Reed sat silently in his office, staring at the thick file that contained almost no valuable information. No blood, no evidence, no physical traces, no strong statements, all forcing him to face the painful reality that the investigation had reached a legal limit he couldn't cross. He couldn't get a warrant to search the Porter house, couldn't detain anyone for deeper questioning, couldn't treat this as a criminal case without any evidence that Ethan had been harmed. All suspicions, intuitions, and feelings of abnormality existed only in his mind, not transferable to the file. To the system, this case was simply an adult missing without clues. By the end of the second week, the administrative meeting at the county office was quick, more procedural than discussion. The legal chief repeatedly emphasized that to get a search warrant or expand the investigation toward crime, they needed specific, tangible, and substantial evidence, which the Ethan case completely lacked. Reed countered with what he sensed from Rachel and Grant's attitudes, but as soon as those words left his mouth, he knew they weren't enough. A sheriff's intuition, no matter how sharp, couldn't replace evidence. At the end of the meeting, with reluctance choking his voice, Reed had to sign the decision to change the case status to missing adult, inactive, meaning Ethan's file was administratively closed. No one in the room looked directly at him then, not because they didn't care, but because everyone understood the helplessness squeezing them all. Logan, a small town that always believed it could protect its own, couldn't find a man right within their borders. When news that the file was closed spread to the community, the town's reaction was slow like dying embers. No more large search groups, no more radio updates every morning, no more urgent meetings in front of the police station. External media attention faded, and Logan began sliding back to its usual rhythm, a rhythm eerily quiet when set against the unresolved disappearance. People still mentioned Ethan, but more cautiously, like an old story they weren't sure whether to bring up. Scattered rumors from before quieted down, not because the truth was found, but because there was nothing new to latch onto. Time made the town stop talking, but it didn't make them forget. For the Mercer family, that quiet was like a new pain. No more hope waiting for morning news, but no answers to close the fear. Linda still left Ethan's jacket in the closet, door slightly ajar as if a light push would bring him in. Cody fell into a state between anger and emptiness, pausing for seconds every time a truck passed by. For Reed, closing the file brought no relief like ordinary missing person cases. It was like covering a deep well that had never been illuminated. Though the file was closed, he kept a copy on his desk, as a reminder that even if the system required him to stop, the case had never truly ended in his mind. But Logan, the small town shrouded in silence, had returned to its familiar peace. A peace not because everything was resolved, but because people had to keep living. Small town life sometimes hides the biggest secrets, and the secret named Ethan Mercer, from week to week, became a void that Logan learned to live with, even if no one truly wanted to. 23 years passed quietly, like new growth rings on the old trees in the Logan forest, and Ethan Mercer's disappearance gradually shifted from an haunting story to a faint layer of memory in the town's mind. The Porter house, once the center of speculation in 1991, now wore a completely different exterior. The front wooden deck had been replaced and repaired multiple times. Old peeling paint gone, replaced by shiny aligned planks as if never scrutinized. Logan residents still occasionally passed by and remembered the afternoon when police filled the front yard, but constant renovations made the past seem covered by new wood, smooth and tight, so no one spoke of it aloud anymore. Many witnesses from that year, those who gave vague statements about similar vehicles, strange noises, or someone's shadow, had long left the state. Some followed family to Kentucky, others to Michigan for work. Many simply lost contact over time. Clues once hoped to reopen the file were swept away by the lives of those very people. And as they vanished from Logan, memories of the day Ethan drove through the main road also faded, like a painting left too long in the sun, leaving only vague outlines. Meanwhile, the Hocking Hills forest, once combed to every tree in the first week's search, had changed beyond recognition. Saplings from 1991 were now tens of feet tall, blocking views. Sparse areas once see-through were now thick walls of foliage, making anyone returning feel lost in a completely different place. Some marked trails had vanished entirely, swallowed by roots and undergrowth. Old rock crevices were deeper, darker, no longer original shape, due to winters and rains eroding them. Nature, in its way, had erased all human traces, including the paths police walked those first 7 days. Logan had changed too. The town added a few stores, a new residential area, and the police station was rebuilt larger. Adults from the time of Ethan's disappearance now had grandchildren, and the story only surfaced when they sat on porches, talking about a strange case Logan once had. Listeners were mostly curious, briefly then forgot. The new generation grew up unattached to the event. To them, Ethan Mercer was a name occasionally appearing in old newspaper clippings flipped by wind in the county library, and Jacob, Ethan's son, was the clearest proof of time passing. The 4-year-old boy, when his father vanished, was now a man in his 20s, living in Columbus, working in a small garage, carrying the Mercer name without fully understanding its meaning. Jacob only heard about his father through fragmented stories. Ethan liked fixing cars, liked touching his son's hair, always told his mother to let Jacob run free. But no one explained clearly what really happened that July day. When Jacob asked in his teen years, Linda only said his father went somewhere and didn't come back. Her voice always trembling slightly, making Jacob understand it was a forbidden memory zone. He grew up with an unnamed void, not sharp pain, but a quiet absence that became part of him. Logan now was so different from the 1991 town. Old wooden walls replaced with new paint, fences repaired, the main road repaved for the 3rd time. Everything changed except one thing. Ethan Mercer's story still had no ending. It no longer appeared in newspapers, no longer discussed in community meetings, but it silently existed like fine dust in the air, needing only a slight movement to stir it up, clear under an accidental ray of sunlight. 24 years passed, leaving an older, quieter town, and a story never closed. But that silence, stretching across decades, never meant the case had fallen into oblivion. It was only waiting for the right moment. And that moment, though no one knew, had begun approaching Logan little by little. In 2015, when the Ohio Cold Case Initiative began reviewing unsolved missing persons cases from the past 3 decades, the name Ethan Mercer stood out on the list, not because there was a lot of evidence, but because his file had almost nothing. It was precisely that emptiness that got it selected. The initiative's selection team wanted cases with unusual darkness, where gaps in the old investigation could be re-examined using new methods. When the file arrived at the Columbus office, it had grown thicker, not from information, but because 3 generations of detectives had added notes tinged with frustration. Nothing found, no confirming witnesses. Vehicle clean, insufficient grounds for a search warrant. That was exactly the kind of case the cold case team thought might reveal something, as time had worn down the initial barriers. Detective Nora Coleman, 41 years old, so meticulous that colleagues joked she took notes on silences, was assigned to handle it. She received the box of files on an April afternoon, with golden sunlight pouring over the long wooden desks in the office, and her first feeling wasn't pity for the victim, but discomfort from something that didn't add up. The case had gone nowhere for 24 years, yet there were details overlooked to an inexplicable degree. In Sheriff Reed's 1991 summary, Nora noticed several points that stood out. First, the complete absence of any traces leading away from the vehicle, something extremely rare in voluntary disappearances. An adult man doesn't simply vanish without leaving footprints, drag marks, or personal items. Second, Rachel Porter's statement was too short, too smooth, too much like a prepared script. A point that Reed back then had noted with a simple but heavy line, "Feels off, not enough to pursue further." To Nora, a statement lacking emotion was always more suspicious than one that rambled. What caught her attention most was the prolonged silence around the Porter home area. No search requests, no follow-ups, not even re-interviews in later years. That was unusual. In the late 1990s, Ohio had seen major advancements in missing persons investigations, yet Ethan's file had barely been updated since 1991. This prompted Nora to write her first note in her personal notebook. Why no return to the Porter home? She flipped to the 1991 forensic report, reading each line carefully, then underlining 3 points. No signs of forced entry on the vehicle. The driver's seat still adjusted exactly for Ethan, not moved as if someone else had driven it, and no discarded items in the vehicle. This created a paradox that the police back then seemingly couldn't dig into. If Ethan drove the vehicle to where it was found, why did he abandon it? And if someone else drove it, why wasn't the seat position changed? Nora stood up, walked to the large corkboard in the office, and began pinning the first post-it notes, marking in red the logical incompatibilities, a term she often used for details that contradicted the victim's natural behavior. Looking at the whole board, it not only revealed the gaps in the 1991 case, but also pointed to a new investigative direction for 2015, finding whoever had tried to hide something. In the compiled witness statements, Nora discovered something else valuable. A few people remembered strange sounds or a red vehicle light passing by, but all those statements were recorded superficially, without expanding into detailed questions. There was no timeline comparison chart, no cross-referencing of statements from neighbors around the Porter home, a major oversight. Finally, what made Nora pause her pen the longest was a faint small note on the last page of the file. Jacob, too young to question. The child from back then was now an adult. 24 years earlier, no one had asked Jacob anything. 24 years later, he might be the only key. Nora closed the file and leaned back in her chair. The case was no longer the empty notes from the 90s. It had taken on a new breath, low but distinct, as if something buried for decades was starting to surface on its own, and she knew this wasn't a case that would let her remain a detached observer. It was pulling her in, line by line. When Detective Nora Coleman requested that Ethan's vehicle, which had been sealed in county storage for over 20 years, be brought to the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation lab, many thought she was clinging to a thread of hope that was far too thin. The vehicle had been examined in 1991 by Holloway and the old forensics team, and the conclusion back then was clear. No blood, no evidence, no breakthrough. A vehicle so clean it was hard to understand, but to Nora, that very too clean aspect was the problem. She wanted it re-examined, this time with modern forensic technology, dozens of times more advanced, something the early 90s couldn't touch. When the vehicle was brought into the lab, bright white LED lights covered the old metal frame, revealing every scratch time had etched into it. It was no longer pristine like in the 1991 photos. Many details were worn, the paint faded, but Nora knew the wear of time sometimes revealed things that had previously been hidden. Field technician Dr. Harris, famous in Ohio investigative circles for his ability to read traces like text, started with a high-resolution camera overview. He scanned every surface, examining every door edge, every small crevice under the dashboard and floor. As soon as the scanner moved to the interior door handle, Harris frowned. Not because he saw something specific, but because what he expected, no clear fingerprints, which time had erased, was replaced by residual organic molecular patches that only analyzers could detect. But the first discovery of the session wasn't in fingerprints or foreign objects. It began when the lab lights were dimmed, and Harris prepared the vehicle for a phase that in 1991 was still very rudimentary, luminol testing. Nora stood behind the protective glass, watching every step closely. As the faint blue light covered the interior surfaces, she felt her heart beat faster, an instinctive reaction any investigator feels when witnessing an experiment that could change the entire case. Harris sprayed the luminol solution on the driver's seat floor first, gently as if dusting off time. 1 second, 2 seconds, then Nora saw it, a faint blue dot glowing like a firefly in the night. Another streak appeared a few inches away, small enough that without the new generation luminol, it would have been completely missed. Then another streak, fainter, like a mark wiped but not perfectly. Harris nodded, his voice even but slow. Trace blood. Not much, but it's there. Nora noted it down immediately, her hand trembling slightly, because that confirmation wasn't just a technical finding. It was the first real evidence, actual evidence, that the vehicle wasn't clean as the 1991 report had concluded. And if there was blood in the vehicle, the question was no longer where did Ethan go, but what happened to him before the vehicle stopped in that remote lot. Harris continued examining the carpet under the gas and brake pedals, areas few would think of, since Holloway back then could only inspect visually. But with enhanced cameras and multi-spectrum LED lights, they discovered something unexpected. A tiny fabric fiber caught on the edge of the brake pedal, pressed deep as if stuck during a hard press or sudden jerk of the foot. Nora requested magnification of the image. The fiber was short, dark-colored, with a fairly thick weave structure. Unlike the old jeans fabric Ethan typically wore in 1991, a point Nora noted immediately, possibly not belonging to the victim, Harris removed it with specialized tweezers and placed it in a micro-evidence bag. "If we're lucky," he said, "we can extract DNA or identify the fabric origin." This couldn't be done in 1991. Nora looked at that tiny fiber as if it were a thread pulling the entire case from darkness into light. But the most significant discovery came from an area no one back then had reason to scrutinize closely: the edge of the passenger side door, which Holloway had noted only as old scratch, unrelated. With side lighting and surface analyzers, Harris saw what Holloway couldn't at the time. The scratch wasn't just one mark, it had two layers, one worn by time, and beneath it a much newer, deeper, sharper layer, like the mark of a strong impact from a hard object. The scratch was positioned higher than typical door dings from normal use, meaning it couldn't be from ordinary vehicle operation. Nora leaned close to the screen. When Harris used low-angle blue light, the groove appeared clear like a thin slash, giving the impression the metal had been slightly bent and then straightened, though barely visible to the naked eye. "High-force impact," Harris said, "very likely from the door being struck from outside, or a heavy object hitting the vehicle. Or," Nora said softly, "someone being shoved hard against the door." Harris was silent for a few seconds, then nodded cautiously, not confirming, but not ruling it out. As they continued, they found a few more small points: a patch of synthetic fibers caught under the back seat, a tiny dent on the rear door edge, visible only under UV light, and a fine dust layer with mineral particles incompatible with Logan soil, suggesting the vehicle may have traveled through different terrain before being abandoned. None of this appeared in any 1991 report, not because the police then were sloppy, but because the technology wasn't powerful enough to see deeper into the truth. Now, with modern luminol, surface analyzers, multi-wavelength LEDs, and micro-vacuum tools, the vehicle, the only object remaining from the day Ethan vanished, finally began to speak. As Harris compiled the preliminary report, Nora stood looking at the vehicle as if it had turned into a living witness. Every faint mark, every dust particle, every fiber contradicted the nothing there conclusion for 24 years. She didn't say it out loud, but in her mind a clear sentence echoed, "Something happened in this vehicle." This was no longer doubt, no longer Reed's overlooked intuition from 1991, no longer the unease in Rachel's statement. This was forensics, real, tangible, undeniable evidence, and it was only beginning to reveal itself. Based on the new forensic findings from the vehicle, Detective Nora Coleman decided to move to the next critical step: reconstructing Ethan's entire travel route using 2015 technology, a tool the Logan police in 1991 had no way to implement. She started by inputting all the old topographic maps, witness statements, the vehicle discovery location, and scattered marked points into the Cold Case Initiative's GIS analysis system, where the latest satellite imagery of Hocking County could overlay the topo maps from 3 decades earlier. As the map layers aligned perfectly, Nora saw exactly what Reed back then could only imagine intuitively. Logan in 1991 was a network of small roads, sparse woods mixed with dense forest, and little-known dirt tracks, all creating a complex maze if someone tried to hide traces. But with 2015 technology, that maze could be peeled back layer by layer. Nora marked the point where Ethan left the shop, the point where witnesses last saw his vehicle in the town center, then the location where the vehicle was found near the wasteland. The system automatically connected the points with the most logical routes based on terrain, 1991 road conditions, and average travel time for each segment. After a few seconds of analysis, the screen displayed 3 possible routes. The first followed the main road through town, then turned southeast, matching witness statements. The second turned earlier toward dirt roads near Hocking Hills. The third, the one Nora focused on most, passed right by the Porter home. Nora zoomed in on the map. Though 1991 had no traffic cameras or GPS, overlaying past terrain with current satellite imagery revealed what old paper maps couldn't easily show. To reach the lot where the vehicle was found, the route past the Porter home was the lowest in elevation, widest among the dirt paths, and the only one not requiring sharp turns onto narrow trails. This didn't prove Ethan passed the Porter home, but it made that route most mechanically logical. Nora entered average speed parameters for 1991 pickup trucks and had the system recalculate travel times. The results made her pause her pen. The time frame from when Ethan was seen in the town center to when the vehicle could have been abandoned didn't match the first or second route at all. Only the road past the Porter home fit the narrow time window provided by witnesses. This meant either Ethan drove past the Porter home during that exact period, or someone else drove the vehicle that way. Both possibilities made the Porter home a logical point on the path, regardless of what Rachel had stated in 1991. Nora continued the analysis by simulating lighting conditions for the date and time. Using July 1991 solar data, the system showed sunlight fading in the sparse eastern Logan woods around the time the town center store witnessed Ethan's vehicle passing. The simulation displayed a scene not too different from old photos of Logan. Dim golden twilight, enough to see a vehicle pass, but not enough to clearly observe license plates or faces. This matched remarkably with the vague witness statements. They saw a dark-colored pickup, but weren't sure who was driving. Nora entered data on the vehicle's discovery location. Just seconds later, the 3D simulation showed the elevation of that area. A small depression surrounded by thick trees, but located exactly at the intersection of two prominent dirt roads from 1991 terrain. One of those roads led straight back toward the Porter home. The key point emerged when Nora overlaid the new forensic evidence layer. The scratch on the door indicating strong impact was positioned in a way entirely possible if the vehicle was forced to stop or struck from the side by someone standing on the narrow dirt road. It couldn't have happened while the vehicle was moving on its own. The system couldn't determine who struck the vehicle, but it confirmed the impact occurred before the vehicle was abandoned, not after. This led Nora to circle in red two routes, the one passing the Porter home and the one from the Porter home to the wasteland. When she connected them, a pattern emerged, a triangle of movement between 3 points: town center, Porter home, and vehicle discovery site. If Ethan was driving himself, she thought, his route should have the logic of someone picking up his child or heading home. But the simulated route lacked that logic. It felt forced, more like a controlled path than a chosen one. This was the first time Nora felt the case wasn't just a disappearance, but a disappearance with a gap inexplicable by the victim's behavior. She returned to the 1991 statements data layer, where Rachel's part clearly read, "He didn't come. I didn't see any vehicle." But when overlaying the satellite map, Nora realized something chilling. The Porter house was positioned at the spot with the most restricted visibility in the entire area. A terrain corner surrounded by large trees, meaning someone inside the house or behind the porch door couldn't see anyone stopping on the road. If Ethan stopped or a collision happened right in front of the house, Rachel could genuinely not see it, because the house's natural sightlines completely obscured both access paths. But that was only true if Rachel was inside the house. If she was on the porch, as some neighbors recalled, she often was in the afternoons. The question reversed entirely. Why did she say she saw nothing? Nora pinned all these points on her corkboard. The only time-matching route passing the Porter home, the scratch compatible with impact before abandonment. The vehicle location fitting a route originating from the Porter home more than anywhere else. Rachel's statement not matching terrain visibility. From the scattered points in the old file, the satellite maps and 2015 analysis pieced together a hazy but suggestive picture. If something happened to Ethan, the Porter home was positioned perfectly for it to occur, without witnesses. Not because it was too obvious, but because it was too secluded. Nora looked at the corkboard and drew a large circle around the name Porter. This wasn't a conclusion. But it was the first time in 24 years that Ethan's path led to a point that couldn't be ignored, and the Porter home was right at its center. Based on the new forensics from the vehicle and the 2015 simulated route diagram, Detective Nora Coleman finally had sufficient grounds to do what Sheriff Reed in 1991 could never achieve: obtain a search warrant for the Porter home. She compiled all the evidence: the luminol blood traces in the car, fabric fibers that didn't match Ethan's clothing, strong scrape marks on the car door, and terrain analysis showing the most logical route passed through the Porter property. Then prepared a nearly 20-page affidavit and submitted it to the Hocking County Prosecutor's Office. The prosecutor read the file in silence, pausing multiple times to flip back to the map and examine the forensic photos. When he looked up at Nora, his eyes held a mixture of astonishment and gravity. If what you've presented is accurate, then this was never just a simple missing person case. And that same afternoon, the search warrant was officially signed. For the first time in 24 years, Ohio law enforcement was permitted to enter the interior of a house that had previously been beyond their reach. The next morning, the county investigation team along with BCI personnel arrived at the Porter residence. This was no longer the cautious observation of 1991. This time, they came with evidence collection kits, UV lights, microparticle scanners, and clear legal authority. The Porter home was now owned by Grant and Rachel, but time had changed them both. Grant had aged, his hair graying, his gaze no longer as sharp as it once was, yet the defensiveness was still evident whenever Ethan's name was mentioned. Rachel, in contrast, was much thinner, her face seemingly stretched taut by something nameless. When Nora presented the search warrant to them, Grant stood motionless for several seconds, as if unable to believe it was happening. He didn't resist, but his stare seemed to pierce through the paper, trying to discern what had forced them to return after all these years. The door opened, and police entered for the first time in the case's history. Right from the living room, Nora noticed significant differences from the 1991 records. The wood flooring had been replaced, the walls repainted, the large windows fitted with new glass. Everything looked clean, orderly, even overly neat. But that neatness felt more staged than natural. However, she hadn't come to judge impressions. She had come to find what time couldn't erase. The forensics team began their protocol: overall photography, checking cracks, examining paint layers, scanning surfaces with blue LED for old protein traces. They didn't expect to find visible bloodstains, as 2 decades were enough to eliminate anything the human eye could detect. But what Nora was targeting wasn't in the living room or hallway, it was in the backyard, where 2015 satellite imagery showed the wooden deck had been replaced at least twice over the decades. Nora led the team to the shed at the end of the yard. The shed was old, paint peeling, metal doors slightly rusted, but the interior was surprisingly tidy. Plastic bins held gardening tools, equipment, paint, lumber. But what drew Nora's attention most was the pile of materials pushed into the corner: several old wooden planks, an old door frame, and a small box containing broken glass shards. She froze for a few seconds. Old decking, old glass. The pair that, in a missing person case, was always suspicious, especially since the 1991 records noted that the Porter deck had been repainted shortly after Ethan's disappearance, but no one recorded whether the deck had been dismantled or not. Nora signaled the technician to open the glass box first. Inside were numerous small shards, not matching the current windows in the Porter home, as the glass now was thicker safety glass. These old shards were thinner, sharper, the common type from the 1980s, 90s. Maybe this is the old glass they replaced, Harris said. But his eyes conveyed a different thought. Replacing glass wasn't suspicious. Keeping the old glass for 24 years was. Next, they moved to the wooden planks. The wood was older, darker than the current deck. Each plank had nails pulled out, worn ends, scratched tops. Nora requested UV lighting. The technician lowered the shed door to create darkness and turned on the powerful UV light. The purple-blue glow covered the wood surfaces, highlighting every grain. At first, It was just cold light reflecting off the fibers. But then, on the underside of the third plank, a faint glowing patch appeared, small but uniform like organic material that had soaked in deep. Not widespread, no clear shape, but enough to differentiate in color from the surrounding wood. Protein? Harris asked. Possibly, Nora replied, her voice slightly hoarse. That faint glow couldn't identify what it was, but in forensics, the key wasn't knowing exactly what it was knowing it shouldn't be there if the deck was simply replaced for home maintenance. Harris leaned closer. This stain is on the underside, not the top where people walk. Someone had to be under the deck, or the deck was once placed over something, Nora said. Or her words hung in the thick air of the shed. No one finished the thought. No need. The technician continued UV scanning the other planks, and on the fifth one, another similar faint streak appeared, again on the underside, again not in a place where normal activity could create an organic trace. The officers in the shed exchanged glances. No one spoke, but everyone understood. This was the first time in nearly a quarter century that physical evidence at the Porter home revealed something beyond ordinary home repairs. While examining the glass box, Harris found a shard with an unusually curved edge, not from dropping, but resembling impact from a fast-moving object. He scanned it under UV, no protein glow, but the glass edge showed unnatural abrasion. Nora immediately photographed it and added to the inventory, old front door glass, broken by forceful impact inward or outward. Outside the shed, Grant stood motionless at the doorway, arms crossed, not interfering, but his gaze tense as a wire. Rachel avoided looking toward the shed, staying back inside the house, hands clenched tightly, as if holding something desperate to escape. When Nora stepped out, Grant asked only one question, his voice low but strained. "What are you looking for?" Nora replied simply, "The truth." And in that brief moment, the two locked eyes as if time had rewound to 1991. Only this time, Nora held evidence in her hands. Not suspicion, not intuition, not rumors, but old wood, old glass, and UV traces on the plank undersides, things time hadn't managed to erase. The Ethan Mercer case had finally moved from void to trace, and the Porter home was no longer a peripheral point in an old story. It had become the central spot on the 2015 forensic map. Rachel Porter was invited to the Hocking County Sheriff's Office interrogation room on Tuesday morning, and from the moment she entered, she sensed the room today was nothing like the gentle information exchange sessions of 1991. No more soft gazes or indirect questions. On the table was a thick file folder, beside it color-printed photos from the shed search, the old wooden planks with UV glow, the box of broken glass shards, and forensic images of Ethan's car, the faint blue luminol traces and fabric fibers under the brake pedal. Rachel sat down, her hands clasped together, thin fingers trembling slightly, while Detective Nora Coleman opened her notebook, set down her pen, and looked directly at her. That gaze held no threat, but the weight of someone holding what Rachel could no longer conceal. "Rachel," Nora began, calm but direct. "We re-examined Ethan's vehicle with new technology. We found faint blood traces, fibers not belonging to him, and strong impact marks on the car door. And when searching your home, we found old deck planks with UV traces on the undersides, marks that can't be explained by routine repairs. I need to hear the story of that night again, but this time, the full truth." Rachel swallowed hard, shoulders drawing in, eyes shifting to the corner of the room, as if seeking something to cling to. When she spoke, her voice was thinner and weaker than 24 years ago. "I already told you, he didn't come." Nora didn't react, just opened a document. "This is your 1991 statement," she read slowly. "You said didn't hear any vehicle, didn't see anyone at the house, nothing unusual. Do you stand by that statement?" Rachel hesitated, her breath catching. "I don't know what else to say." Nora placed the old deck photo in front of her. "Rachel, this is old wood from your deck. It was in the shed, along with old door glass. And this," she slid over the enlarged UV image, is an organic trace on the underside of a plank. How do you explain this? Rachel stared at the photo, her face paling, hands clenching until the knuckles went white. Grant was the one who fixed the deck. I didn't ask why. I don't know. The awkwardness in her response made Nora tilt her head, observing closely. You don't know? Or you don't want to know? Rachel opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. She tried biting her lip to stay composed, but Nora clearly saw something rising in her eyes, not defiance, but fear. A fear suppressed for 24 years. Nora placed the photo of Ethan's car on the table next. There's blood in the car, strong impact. Ethan didn't abandon it there voluntarily. I think you know this. Rachel closed her eyes briefly, then opened them with a dazed look. I didn't know he was hurt, or that things happened like you say. I only know that night, everything wasn't normal. Nora seized on that immediately. Not normal how? Rachel shook her head, but this time Nora didn't let her retreat. Rachel, this isn't about protecting someone anymore. This is about a man missing for over 2 decades. If something happened right in front of your house, you have to say it. Rachel breathed rapidly, hand over her chest. I was scared of Grant. I always have been. From that year until now. Nora didn't respond, just waited in silence. And that silence finally made Rachel start speaking, slowly, haltingly. That night around dusk, I was in the kitchen. The kitchen window faces the front yard. I didn't see anything but tree shadows. But she paused. Inhaling deeply, I heard a loud noise. Nora sat up straighter. What kind of noise? Rachel clenched her hands until the knuckles were deathly white. Like something hitting metal, very loud. I thought maybe the garage door slammed shut from the wind. But your garage is on the right side, Nora said, and the metal sound you described doesn't match a normal garage door. Rachel stopped breathing for a beat. Clearly, she'd thought about this for 24 years. I didn't dare look outside, she said, her voice dropping nearly to a whisper. Grant didn't want me involved in anything that happened outside. Nora leaned forward. Did you know Ethan might have been in the yard at that moment? Rachel's face twitched. I'm not sure, she replied, but the words were so thin, Nora knew it wasn't true. Which direction was the noise from? From the front door, Rachel whispered. Right by the old deck. I remember the echo position clearly. It wasn't far, just a bit from the kitchen wall. Nora pulled the broken glass photo closer. We found old glass. The front door was replaced. The cuts on the glass matched strong impact force. Rachel closed her eyes in prolonged pain. Grant told me it was neighborhood kids kicking a ball into the door. But no neighbors had kids kicking balls in that direction, Nora said, her voice sharpening. And no one reported hearing glass break. Rachel trembled, and for the first time in the interrogation, tears streamed down. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to trust. Grant, he would get angry, smash things, say things, she choked. Say that if anyone interfered in this house's business, they'd regret it. Nora softened her tone. Rachel, you're not responsible for what you didn't cause, but you know something happened. You heard it, and you stayed silent out of fear. Rachel nodded, no longer hiding. I heard that noise. I wanted to look out. But Grant went straight to the door right after. I only saw his back. Nora recorded every word. Did you hear anyone speak, shout, call out? Rachel slowly. No one speaking. Just the impact sound. Then, very quick footsteps. Nora looked deeply into Rachel's eyes. What do you think happened that night? And for the first time, Rachel didn't evade. She didn't say I don't know, nor repeat, he didn't come. She just said, in a voice, as if releasing something that had weighed on her chest for 2 decades, I think Ethan did come. And I think something happened before I could look out. A long silence filled the room, not the silence of denial, but of a truth, finally cracking open. Nora set down her pen. Rachel's statement, though not everything, no longer matched the story she told in 1991. And that contradiction, along with the loud impact she had hidden for 24 years, was something this case had never had before. Rachel sat with her head bowed, like someone who had held a secret too long, and finally lacked the strength to keep it. The Ethan Mercer case from here was no longer vague dots on a map, but began to take shape, a shape Nora knew would lead to bigger, deeper, and darker questions than anything Logan had ever imagined. The glass shard recovered from the Porter's shed was immediately transferred to the Ohio BCI Materials Analysis Lab the next morning, and within just a few hours, Detective Nora Coleman received the first call, stating that this glass didn't break in a normal way. When she arrived at the lab, materials technician and expert Thomas Laird was standing before a light table with the glass shards laid out in rows, illuminated under sharp fluorescent lights. The fracture lines radiated like snow veins, each line meaningful if you knew how to read them. Laird didn't beat around the bush. "You said this might be glass from the Porter front door in 1991. Nora nodded, and he slid an enlarged photo toward her. "Then look closely at this fracture pattern. The cracks didn't radiate in a starburst, like from a hand smash or kids throwing rocks. They formed concentric force fractures, lines radiating evenly and denser on one side, almost indicating force traveling from outside in or inside out at high velocity." Laird used a metal pointer on the fracture origin. "This is the entry point. The impact wasn't slow force, couldn't be a hand strike, couldn't be a heavy object dropping. This type of break," he looked at Nora, "results from a hard object moving fast hitting the glass." Nora felt a chill run down her spine. Laird showed the next photo under sodium light analysis. "If I had to estimate based on fracture angle and spread, I'd say high-speed impact, precision within the range of extreme force." He paused, then continued slowly, "Similar to glass being struck hard by a long, rigid object at high speed. Could be a tool, could be a human body slammed into it." Nora gripped the table edge lightly. "You're sure it's not temperature-related or frame twisting?" "Subbed." Laird shook his head immediately. "I checked. No thermal expansion signs, no edge deformation, direct impact." He held a shard to the light, pointing to the sharp edge, the break uneven and displaced. "I compared to the current Porter home glass. What they use now is thicker. This shard is pre-1995 common type, meaning they replaced it." Nora already knew this from the scene, but lab confirmation made it legal fact. "Any other reason they'd keep old glass?" Nora asked. Laird shrugged. "Almost none. When people replace glass, they dump it all in trash. Keeping shards, not normal behavior." He glanced at the box. "Especially when many shards were carefully wrapped in plastic bins, as if someone didn't want them exposed." Nora was silent for seconds, then asked the key question. "Can you determine specific force?" Laird nodded. "I ran material simulation. For this glass density and thickness, breaking force had to be substantial enough to rebound the impacting object, and based on fracture direction," he flipped another photo. "The object was either head, shoulder, or upper torso of a person slammed face-on into the door." The lab fell silent. Though Laird didn't say it outright, Nora understood the implication. Someone had violently impacted the Porter door the night Ethan disappeared, and force strong enough for this fracture pattern was rarely accidental. Laird continued. "Note the secondary cracks." He pointed to 3 45-degree radiating lines. "They indicate the force wasn't from inside running out, but from outside impacting the door." Nora noted quickly, "Impact from outside, possible altercation at door. Can you reconstruct impact angle?" she asked. "Yes," Laird said. "And I did." He turned on the simulation screen. There, a model of the glass door appeared with fractures matching the real shards. A simulated force vector was applied. A long object, high contact angle, striking from outside. "With the entry point height," Laird said. "Impact was at adult chest level." Nora stared intently. "So what do you think this is?" "I don't conclude behavior," Laird replied. "Just physics. But if you ask me, this wasn't an accident. This was a hard, intentional or struggle-related strike." He paused a beat. then summarized. And Nora, this fracture pattern occurs in high-velocity collisions, possibly a person slammed into the door, or a heavy rigid object striking when people inside and outside were in strong interaction. Nora breathed deeply. Thus, 3 key points confirmed by scientific evidence. 1. The Porter front door had been broken by strong non-accidental impact. 2. Force originated from outside the door. 3. The glass type matched the Ethan disappearance era, aligning with Rachel's story timeline. Nora immediately cross-referenced Rachel's new statement, especially the loud noise detail and Grant going straight to the door afterward. If the noise Rachel heard wasn't the garage door but the glass impact, then the day Ethan vanished perfectly matched the door replacement timing. Nora reviewed the car forensics photos: strong impact on passenger door, impact at car, impact at Porter door. 2 impact surfaces, same strong force signs, same time, same area. She understood this glass shard had changed the case's nature. No longer ambiguity, no longer vague 1991 statements, no longer no leads for 2 decades. This was the first physical evidence confirming a violent event occurred at the Porter home, the exact night Ethan disappeared. As Nora left the lab, she carried the glass box in evidence, but the heaviest thing wasn't in the box. It was in the question, now clearer than ever: if the door broke from strong outside impact, then who hid it, and why did Rachel have to hide it for 24 years? The glass analysis results were still warm on Nora's desk when the lab called with the second phone call, one that she immediately understood was more important than any previous report. "We need you at BCI right away," the voice of technician Lynn Evans rang out, straightforward, no explanations, and that was enough for Nora to leave her office within 5 minutes, driving straight to the State DNA Analysis Center. When she entered the room, the cold blue light from the fume hoods and analyzer screens gave the entire space a solemn air, like places where the truth could no longer be hidden. On the table were 2 evidence bags from the Porter house, 2 pieces of underside deck wood that had once glowed under UV, seized during the search of the shed. Lynn Evans, the lead biologist, looked at Nora with eyes that no longer maintained professional distance. The eyes of someone who knew the results she was about to reveal would change the nature of an entire case. "We ran the test 3 times, Lynn began, her voice low but clear, and all 3 times gave the same result. She placed the DNA analysis printout in front of Nora, a dense string of characters, but the first 2 lines were enough to make Nora hold her breath. "Match to Ethan Mercer, probability 99.9998%. The world in the lab narrowed to a single heartbeat. No more doubt, no more speculation, no more possibility of error from outdated techniques like in 1991. The blood on the underside of the old deck, not the top surface, not where feet would touch, but the underside where no one could stand without lying flat on the ground, was Ethan Mercer's." Lynn continued explaining the results, but Nora needed a few seconds to refocus. "We had to extract the sample very carefully," Lynn explained, "because the material was so small, possibly just a droplet trace or a microscopic amount absorbed into the wood from biological moisture at the time. But modern equipment can isolate nanofragments, and the sample matched the DNA profile from Ethan's personal items provided by the family." Nora said nothing, just stared at the old wood plank sealed in a tempered glass case, as if it carried the breath of the man who had vanished more than 2 decades ago. "The blood stain is deep," Lynn added. "Not a spray pattern, not a heavy smear, but consistent with impact force causing blood to seep from above and soak down through the wood gaps to the underside." Nora immediately noted in her notebook, "Blood seeped from the top side of the deck, injured person standing or lying on it." If someone was injured right on the deck, Lynn continued, even a small amount of blood could seep through the gaps. Then the deck was dismantled, repainted or replaced, but the underside wasn't treated, the stain remained. That was exactly what had happened. The old deck was removed, stored in the shed, but the underside, the hidden side, no one expected it to preserve the truth for over 2 decades. "We also tested the second sample," Lynn said, pulling out the second piece of wood, and it matched Ethan's DNA too, though in lower quantity. Nora felt her heart pound. 2 different locations. Yes. 2 spots, a few inches apart. Not overlapping. That creates a plausible scenario. Nora readied her pen. If someone bleeds from a minor injury, the blood is usually concentrated in one spot. But if there's strong impact, or the person moves, or is dragged a short distance on the deck, small traces could be left in more than one place. Lynn paused, letting Nora connect the rest, and Nora did. The old deck had witnessed Ethan's blood falling, little small but there. That was enough to change the entire classification of the case. Beyond the DNA, Lynn continued, we also detected other protein traces intermixed, unknown origin, but consistent with soft tissue under impact force. Not enough to identify a second person, but enough to support a collision event. Forensics never gives the full story. It only provides physical truth, but this physical truth weighed more than every statement ever recorded in the old file. Nora flipped through her notes. Strong impact mark on car door, similar force on porterhouse window glass, blood under deck, belonging to Ethan deck, replaced within days of Ethan's disappearance. 3 pieces of evidence, 3 different locations, 3 different types of damage, all linking to one point, the porterhouse. When the DNA result was confirmed for the 3rd time, BCI immediately submitted the comparison sample to the CODIS system to rule out errors. And just 2 hours later, the 4th confirmation email arrived. 100% match with the verified sample from Ethan's old toothbrush. No more room for interpretation. No more escape for any alternative explanation. Nora felt like all 24 years of Logan's silence were converging on this moment. She knew that identifying Ethan's blood on the deck meant the missing person case had officially transformed into a felony, one potentially murder or violent assault leading to concealment. In Ohio law, evidence of the victim's blood at the suspect's home, especially at a site showing signs of impact force, is grounds to open a homicide investigation, even without a body recovered. What Sheriff Reed couldn't do in 1991, Nora could now do: submit the new file to the prosecutor, request reclassification from missing person to suspected homicide. But before leaving the lab, Nora requested to see the blood spatter distribution simulation. Lynn opened the software reconstruction based on the UV trace positions and seepage patterns. On the model appeared the wooden deck and 2 purple glowing spots, 2 blood drops under 2 adjacent gaps. The analyzer evaluated the seepage and provided 3 possibilities: 1 victim standing injured, blood dripping down through the gaps; 2 victim lying on side or propped up, blood falling with movement; 3 victim pushed against the deck surface, causing soft tissue contact and seepage downward. All 3 scenarios led to the same conclusion: Ethan was on the deck when injured. Not in the car, not on the road, not in the woods, but right on the porterhouse deck. And if blood fell onto the deck, Ethan did not leave that place of his own free will. As Nora left the laboratory, the afternoon sun cast long shadows of her car across the parking lot. Holding the DNA results, she felt like she was carrying the weight of 24 years of compressed truth. A truth no longer rumor, no longer suspicion, no longer intuition, but scientific evidence. Ethan Mercer was injured at the porterhouse. And if his blood was under the deck, in a place no ordinary person would ever reach, it meant the deck had concealed a scene that Logan could not see in 1991. A scene that now, finally, had emerged from drops of blood that refused to be erased. From here, the Ethan Mercer case was no longer a question mark. It had become a criminal case, and the old porterhouse deck had become the first witness, after 2 decades, to recount the story that unfolded on it. Grant Porter was brought into the interrogation room at 9 a.m. Not handcuffed, but clearly no longer just an informant, as in 1991. He was invited to sit, the door closed, the recorder turned on, and Detective Nora Coleman placed a thick case file in front of him, a move enough to make any pretense of calm from Grant fragile, because he knew anyone who had dealt with police understood a large file in front never meant good news. He sat upright, shoulders tense, hands clasped, as if to keep them from shaking, but the deep wrinkles on his forehead and uneasy eyes had already betrayed him before Nora spoke. "Grant," Nora began, her voice low and absolutely not soft. "We have new forensic results, and I want to give you a chance to explain before we submit the file to the prosecutor." Grant didn't respond immediately. He stared at Nora as if trying to read how much she knew. "I told everything in '91, he shrugged, trying to stay calm. "Nothing more to say." Nora didn't reply right away. She opened the evidence box, placed on the table the enlarged photo of the luminol trace from Ethan's car, then the fabric fiber under the pedal, then the photo of the old broken glass from strong impact, and finally, the deck wood with the lab-confirmed DNA trace. She didn't need to say more when Grant saw the last photo. His reaction spoke for him. He leaned back slightly, eyes wide, face flushing, then turning pale. "What do you have to say about this?" Nora asked. Grant took a deep breath, but it came out too shaky to call calm. "Just old wood," he said. But his voice no longer had the defiant certainty of 2 decades ago. "I replaced the deck multiple times." "People do that, and you kept the old deck in the shed for 24 years?" Nora asked, not hiding her skepticism. "No one keeps junk that long unless there's a reason." Grant pressed his lips together, his tone turning sour. "Maybe I forgot. Maybe I was too lazy to throw it out." "No," Nora replied. "You didn't forget, because the underside of the deck has Ethan Mercer's blood, and you knew that." As if punched in the chest, Grant lurched forward. "Blood? No, I didn't." He stopped, realizing he'd said too much. Nora didn't give him a chance to take it back. "Forensics confirmed the trace under the deck is Ethan's blood, not an accidental drop. Not a cut finger, not an accident. Seepage from above down. And that deck was right in front of your door in 1991. Grant looked down at the table, breathing heavily, hands clenching into fists. I don't know what you're talking about. Maybe someone broke in. Maybe broke in and left Ethan's blood under your deck?" Nora cut in, her voice sharp as a blade. "And you replaced the deck right after? How do you explain that coincidence?" Grant tried to speak, but Nora continued, showing him the photo of the old glass. "This is your front door glass, broken by strong force, impact from outside in. Analysis says it was struck at adult chest height, and it was replaced a few days after Ethan disappeared. Grant, what do you think?" Grant slammed his hand on the table, the first time in the interrogation, revealing his true nature. "You're trying to make something up. Just because of broken glass you think I—" "Not just the glass," Nora interrupted, her voice turning cold. "It's the blood trace in Ethan's car. The fabric fiber, not his under the pedal. The strong impact on the car door. The UV trace on the deck. DNA underneath. The force mark on your house glass." Grant nearly exploded. "That's just speculation. No one can prove I did anything." Nora tilted her head, her eyes piercing through his defenses. "So that night, what did you do when you heard the loud noise?" Grant froze. He turned to look at Nora, eyes wide with fear and anger. "I didn't. Rachel heard it," Nora said slowly. "She stated it was a loud impact like metal hitting something, and right after, you went out the door." Grant stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly. "She's lying. Rachel always—" Nora placed both hands on the table. "Grant, she's been afraid of you for 24 years, but this time she talked." Grant breathed heavily, face flushing red, then gradually paling. The pulse at his temple was visible. "I don't know what she said. She's always—" Nora didn't let him deflect. "You said in 1991 that Ethan never came to the house, but forensics shows his blood right under the deck in front of your door." "Impossible," Grant said. But the words were so weak, they carried no weight. "I never touched him." Nora emphasized each word. "Grant, why is Ethan's blood on your deck?" Grant turned his face away. No answer, no rebuttal, no denial, just silence. The silence of someone trying to hold an old story from collapsing, but knowing it had already started cracking everywhere. Nora kept pushing. You're known for having a temper. Neighbors heard you smashing things. A 1990 report noted you broke someone's car mirror during an argument. You were warned for a fight at a gas station. All instances of losing control. Grant gripped the table edge until his knuckles turned white. That's old stuff. I got over it. Like with Ethan? Nora asked. Grant slammed his hand down again. I didn't kill anyone. Nora hadn't said he killed anyone. She just said, Grant, you've lied for 24 years. Your statements no longer match. Forensics doesn't lie. The deck doesn't lie. The glass doesn't lie. Grant sank back into his chair, hands covering his face. For the first time in the interrogation, he was no longer angry. He was just bewildered, trembling, like someone knowing the noose was tightening. Grant, Nora said, more softly, but not gently. You need to explain what happened that night. This is your last chance to give a statement that helps yourself. He looked up, eyes bloodshot, voice hoarse, weak, choked. I lost control. I didn't. Nora said nothing, waiting. A thick silence like night fog covered the interrogation room. Grant took a deep breath, lips trembling as they parted. But then he clamped them shut, clasped his hands in front, and shook his head like someone trying to keep a door from flying open. I don't remember, he said. But even he knew those words had no value left. Nora turned off the recorder. We'll continue, she said, and you'll have to explain everything. When Grant was let out, Nora looked at the file on the table. For the first time in 24 years, the prime suspect was no longer a vague shadow in a quiet town, but standing clearly in front of her. Grant Porter, the last person to see Ethan alive, and also the last person standing on the deck, stained with his blood. Grant Porter was brought back to the interrogation room in the late afternoon, after nearly 3 hours isolated in a windowless holding room, where every passing minute was designed to erode his final defenses. When the door opened, Nora Coleman entered, carrying not a thick file like before, but just a thin envelope. That made Grant even more uneasy, because he knew silence was the most dangerous thing. Nora sat across from him, turned on the recorder, then opened the envelope and placed items one by one on the table. Photo of the deck with Ethan's DNA marks. Photo of the door glass broken by high-speed impact. Simulated route map leading through the Porter house. And Rachel's latest statement transcript. Without saying much, Nora just pushed the statement toward him. Rachel told the truth, she said, her voice low and leaving him no room to dodge. Grant didn't pick up the paper, just stared at it as if the words were burning his skin. What did she say? Nora kept her gaze direct, unwavering. That there was a loud impact that night, that you rushed out the door right after the noise, and that she's always been afraid of you. Grant suppressed a deep breath, but Nora didn't give him recovery time. She held up the glass photo. This wasn't kids kicking a ball. This is external impact force at adult chest height. And it happened the very week Ethan disappeared. Grant closed his eyes for a moment, his temples twitching hard, as if the entire past was crashing down on him. But Nora continued, each piece of evidence like a targeted blow to his weakest defenses. The blood under the deck, not on top, impossible by accident, is Ethan Mercer's. The deck was removed, stored away. The glass was replaced. Ethan's car had major impact damage. All of it happened around your house, on the same night. Grant's hands shook. He opened his eyes, exhausted, desperate, but still trying to hold on. I didn't kill him. I didn't touch him. So how did Ethan's blood get under your deck? Nora asked, so gently that the gentleness felt like the sharpest blade. Grant didn't answer. Nora leaned forward, voice lowered. Grant, 24 years. You don't have to run anymore. This evidence, it's what you can't deny. He bowed his head, hands clutching his hair, trembling as if caught between two worlds, one the truth he'd tried to bury for 2 decades. The other reality stripping away every layer. I didn't mean to, he whispered, voice breaking. Nora watched him but didn't rush. What did you do? Grant shook his head repeatedly, more reflex than answer. But on his face, resistance had turned to despair. That night, I just wanted to talk, just wanted him to stop. He choked there, as if his body knew that once the story crossed that threshold, there was no turning back. Nora gently placed another photo on the table, the reconstruction simulation of a body, pushed into glass, matching the break angle. Grant, the door glass doesn't lie. Grant looked at the photo as if seeing the very moment he'd tried to bury. His face crumpled, hands tapping erratically on the table edge. Then he said softly, like someone who had run out of strength to hide. He came to the front of the house. I didn't think he'd come. I was angry. I lost control. Nora kept her expression unchanged. What happened? Grant closed his eyes for a long time. No more defenses, no more anger, just a man crushed by truth until he couldn't bear another hour. Ethan shouldn't have been there, Grant said, voice sliding across the line between confession and plea for forgiveness. I went out, he talked. We argued. Then he gasped for air, chest heaving, hands clenching in front of him, as if protecting himself from his own memory. Nora didn't push. The pressure of silence was what she used instead of questions. It was more effective than any threat. Grant opened his eyes, and in that moment, he was no longer the aggressive man, no longer the one the whole town once feared approaching, but someone who had endured 24 years with a secret eating away at his mind. I didn't mean to make him fall that hard, he said, as if clinging to the last bit of humanity. But when he fell, I panicked. Nora slowly asked the final question that every interrogation like this reaches, Grant, where did you take Ethan? In the room, only Grant's heavy breathing and the steady hum of the recorder remained. Grant leaned back in his chair, eyes staring into the space in front, then clenched his hands as if holding something in them. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he didn't wipe them. He just swallowed and released the words Nora knew she had been waiting for since reopening the file. I'll show you the place. In that moment, the interrogation room felt like all the air had been sucked out. After 24 years, the final silence had been broken. Grant Porter had collapsed, and the Ethan Mercer case had just entered a phase that Logan, Ohio, had never dared imagine. Grant Porter was led out of the interrogation room in silence, uncuffed but flanked closely by 2 officers on either side. As Nora followed behind, she clearly saw the change in his every step, no longer the anger, no longer the defiant posture, just the heavy collapse of a man who had realized there was nothing left to hide. When they reached the vehicles, Grant raised his hand to shield his eyes from the late afternoon sun, then spoke in a voice, almost a whisper, "We can't drive all the way. We have to walk in. It's deep in Wayne." That was the first time he voluntarily mentioned the location. The convoy departed Hocking County under the escort of sheriff's deputies and a BCI team carrying excavation tools. Nora sat in the front seat of the vehicle, transporting Grant, quietly observing him through the rearview mirror. He kept both hands on his knees, head bowed, eyes fixed on the floor of the vehicle, but every time the car turned onto a familiar road, his eyelids trembled slightly, as if places he thought time had buried were coming back to choke him. As they entered the edge of Wayne National Forest, the clock shifted to dim evening, the light filtering through the dark green canopy, casting torn strips of shadow over the long forest road. The dirt roads from 1991 now only remained in minimally maintained sections, many parts almost erased. Grant pointed, his voice hoarse. "Turn left here." "No, not the new trail, the old one, on the other side." The vehicles had to stop when the road became too narrow. From here, they had to walk. The search team prepared flashlights, GPS, topo maps, and carried evidence collection bags. An officer suggested cuffing Grant for safety, but Nora shook her head. "He's cooperating." Grant glanced at her with fleeting gratitude, then turned away and stepped into the forest. Under the tree cover, small sounds like wind through branches made Grant pause at times, as if each sound pulled him back to a different moment. They walked for more than 20 minutes, then half an hour, then nearly 40 minutes without seeing anything notable beyond large trees, twisting roots, and moss-covered rocks. Grant stopped multiple times, breathing heavily, wiping his face, trying to locate the old path as the forest had nearly swallowed everything. Back then, this area was more open. The trees weren't this thick, he said, his voice shaking, not from exhaustion, but from facing memories. We have to go up the slope, then down into the rock hollow. Nora tilted her head to look at the map. There's an old system of rock hollows to the east, but the terrain has changed a lot. Are you sure it's east? Grant closed his eyes, trying to remember as if the truth lay in the dark corners of his mind. There was a big oak trunk split in two, rocks slumped to the left. The forensics team turned on high-powered lights, sweeping the forest canopy. And then, the light hit a massive tree trunk, split into two branches like a natural fork. Grant saw it first and froze, his body shrinking as if struck. That, it's the one. No one said anything more. They moved closer. Beyond the tree was a sloping embankment, covered in thick decayed leaves up to the ankles. Grant stood at the edge of the slope, looking down into the darkness below, where the ground dipped and a large curved rock formed a natural overhang. He touched his knees, trembling, then whispered, "There, right under that rock hollow." They shone lights down. The rocks stacked like the entrance to a low natural arch, just over a meter high, completely hidden from the path. The rock surface was covered in deep green moss and thick layers of wind-blown decayed leaves, making the area look untouched for decades. As the light swept deeper, Nora felt the entire atmosphere change, as if a forest secret was stirring under the light. Behind those rocks, Grant continued, his voice breaking. I pushed leaves, pushed dirt, and he stopped, his face straining to the extreme. Nora raised her hand to signal the forensics team to prepare, but not to enter until Grant confirmed the spot. We need you to point to the exact place. Grant nodded, then slowly walked down the slope. Two officers flanked him to prevent slipping. He approached the rock hollow, having to stoop low to fit inside. His breathing echoed faintly in the narrow space. He reached forward and pointed, right here. I dug here. Not deep. I couldn't dig deep. The ground was hard. The entire team stood silent. As Grant tremblingly pointed to a spot less than half a meter from the edge of the hollow, a slightly depressed area compared to the surroundings, an anomaly the naked eye would hardly notice without knowing what to look for. The forensics team removed leaves with specialized tools, avoiding bare hands. Nora knelt down, shining her flashlight close to the ground. Beneath the decayed leaves and mud, the soil color changed, darker, looser, like soil that had been dug and refilled. She lightly touched the edge with her fingertip, leaving no mark, just enough to confirm the soil structure. This is disturbed soil, the technician said quietly. It can't be natural. Grant stepped back, leaning against the rock, hands clutching his head as if his entire body was collapsing. I didn't want to. I didn't mean to. Nora did not respond. Her job was not to comfort the man who had hidden a body, but to find the truth buried beneath this soil. The excavation team began digging gently, thin layers, separating leaves, brushing aside small roots, using soft brushes to clean the surface. The soil deepened, layer by layer. The smell of damp earth and moss wafted in the air, cold and thick against the skin. And then, when the sixth layer was brushed aside, the technician stopped, the flashlight glinting on something dark, unlike soil, unlike rock, a piece of gray fabric, covered in mud, but intact enough to recognize. Fabric, the technician said, voice lowering. Grant touched the rock behind him, eyes tightly shut. That's his shirt. Nora said nothing, just staring into the dark hollow, where a secret buried for 24 years was finally surfacing under forensic lights. Wayne National Forest stood silent around them, wind whispering lightly through the canopy, like the sigh of a place that had kept silence too long. And Grant Porter, trembling before the rock hollow, knew that from this moment on, everything he had hidden deep in the forest had nowhere left to hide. The forensics team began work in the rock hollow of Wayne National Forest with near absolute caution, knowing that any mistake could damage the rare traces remaining after 24 years buried in forest soil. The technicians' hands moved slowly, using small stainless steel spoons to remove soil in handfuls, placing it into sorting trays, then using soft bristle brushes to clear mud from anything that did not belong to the forest. White LED lights pierced the low hollow, illuminating patches of moss, grains of black soil, while Nora stood close at the edge of the slope, observing. Not stepping in but following every movement, as if trying to reread history through each streak of soil brushed aside. Just minutes later, the first call came for an object. A technician lifted a piece of fabric, covered in mud but with the woven fiber structure clear under the light, thick cotton, light gray, partially rotted, but with the collar fold still intact enough to recognize. His shirt, Grant whispered from behind, voice trembling and hoarse as if each word cut his throat. No one responded. The work continued. The excavation team moved to the lower soil layer. Thin roots intertwined, making digging more difficult. Some roots had to be cut with specialized shears to avoid disturbing the scene. When the 8th layer was cleared, the flashlight caught a small round object, thumbnail-sized, glinting dull silver with age. The technician used tweezers to lift it from the soil, and as soon as the back was turned, Nora recognized a detail the Mercer family had mentioned in 1991, a small metal pendant Ethan always wore on a necklace, engraved EM. The 2 letters now faint but still readable under the light. The air around the hollow grew heavier. From his position behind the line of officers, Grant clutched the edge of his shirt, eyes wide and darkening like deep pits. He turned his face away, but it changed nothing. The first personal evidence had been found. The work continued. This time, it was not an item, but something that made the entire group pause for seconds, as if all realized the boundary between missing and deceased was appearing. A small bone fragment, slightly curved in biological structure, lay mixed in the mud, partially exposed when the brush cleared soil for the 3rd time. The technician leaned in, gently blowing off the final soil layer, then placed a plastic marker. Clavicle, he said softly. Human. The forensics team immediately shifted to strict remains handling protocol, marking positions with laser distance measurement, taking 360-degree photos, recording excavation depth by segments. Nora stood blocking Grant's view of that moment, but Grant was not looking at the bone. He had closed his eyes long ago, his body shaking in waves as if memories were suddenly returning, forcing him to face the truth he had evaded for 24 years. Then more bones, a rib segment, a small portion of an arm bone, a finger phalanx scratched by time. Each bone lifted was immediately placed in remains bags, coated, and sent straight to the mobile lab vehicle parked at the forest entrance. During excavation, the technician found a small object pressed under heavy soil, a rusted old key, but still showing the car manufacturer logo on the head. When held to the light, Nora recognized it as the key to Ethan's pickup truck. For 24 years, the Mercer family had kept the spare both bought at the same time. No coincidence. The rock hollow held the truth. The layers of soil, rocks, roots that had tried to wrap that secret were now being peeled away, and under the 12th layer, a larger section of skull appeared. The technician knelt, using a soft brush to clean each contour. Skull, consistent with an adult, the specialist said in a low voice. Matches Ethan's age at disappearance. It took nearly 3 hours to collect all remaining bone fragments in the hollow. Ethan was no longer intact. Time and forest soil had taken most, but enough to reconstruct a skeleton of a man approximately 24-30 years old, and enough to know the body position when buried, lying on its side, right hand pressed to chest, legs slightly bent, like a posed placement rather than a natural fall. Finally, as the remains box was sealed, the forensics team found one last item, a small piece of shoe leather, the remnant of the brand of boots Ethan often wore for work. The leather had darkened to black, but the stitching was still recognizable. When the final box was closed, Nora pulled out her phone to call the Columbus DNA lab. "I want this sample prioritized," she said. "Put it at the top." 2 days later, results arrived as a PDF report with a confirmation call. DNA matched Ethan Mercer's profile completely. No speculation remained. The remains found in Wayne National Forest were Ethan's. The news reached the Mercer home on a quiet afternoon, as Linda Mercer sat on her daughter's balcony in Lancaster. When Nora stepped onto the porch, Linda saw her eyes and understood without a word. She placed her hand over her mouth, shoulders slumping as if her body could no longer bear the weight of 24 years of pain. Nora knelt beside her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "We found Ethan," she said, voice hoarse. Linda did not cry immediately. She bowed her head into her hands, trying to steady her breathing. Then finally the sound suppressed for years burst out like a dam breaking. "My boy, he's finally home." In that moment, the silence was no longer painful silence, but the silence of a door closing, and also the silence of the next door opening, as the truth prepared to step into the light before the entire town of Logan, Ohio. When the DNA results were released, and the rock hollow in Wayne National Forest became the official crime scene, the investigation turned not only to Grant Porter, but also back to the person who had stood in the shadows for 24 years, Rachel. The morning after Ethan's remains were removed from the forest, Nora Coleman and the Hocking County prosecutor decided to summon Rachel to the police station one last time, not to ask more questions, but to confront her with her full share of responsibility. Rachel arrived looking drained of life, hair slightly disheveled, eyes red but dry. When Nora placed the photos on the table, the old deck, broken glass, bloodstains, along with Grant's statement recorded just hours earlier, Rachel only closed her eyes slightly, like someone who had long awaited this truth to find her. "Rachel Porter," Nora began, voice no longer soft, as in previous interrogations. "You are under consideration for concealing a crime and obstructing investigation for 24 years. Do you understand that?" Rachel sighed, hands on the table, head bowed. "I know," she said, voice thin like mere breath. "I knew this would come." Nora did not re-ask what Rachel had previously stated. This time it was not gathering information, but establishing legal accountability. "You lied to police in 1991 about hearing noises. You denied Ethan ever came to the house. You also claimed not to remember replacing the glass and knew nothing about replacing the deck. But forensics showed the deck was repainted right after Ethan disappeared, a fresh coat over wood that had just been removed." Rachel's hands trembled. "Grant, he told me to repaint it. Said the deck was rotted, damaged. I didn't dare ask." "And the glass?" Nora asked. "Who replaced it?" Rachel bit her lip. "Grant brought new glass home. Told me not to tell anyone. I didn't know why, but Nora interrupted. "Didn't know why, or knew but didn't dare admit." Rachel flinched slightly, hands clasping together, then finally slumped in admission. "I knew something was wrong, but I thought if I stayed silent, it would all go away. I was afraid of Grant, afraid of his look, afraid for myself, afraid for our child." Nora observed her for seconds. "You painted the deck after Ethan's blood had soaked down. You helped Grant cover everything. You kept the old glass in storage. You lied to police about noises that night. And when Grant brought his truck back that night, you didn't report it to police. This isn't mere fear, Rachel. This is obstruction of justice." Rachel broke into sobs, but not the kind meant to evade guilt. It was like the final crack of a shell stretched too long. "I didn't mean to harm Ethan," she sobbed. "I swear to God, I didn't want this to happen. Nora closed the case file. "I understand you didn't directly cause Ethan's death, but you concealed the crime for 24 years. You let the Mercer family live in tragedy all that time, and you helped Grant evade legal responsibility while knowing what he had done." The door behind opened, 2 officers entered and stood on either side of Rachel. The prosecutor stepped forward, placing the arrest warrant before her. Obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, misleading investigators. Rachel did not resist. She simply raised her hands slowly, wrists trembling slightly, as the cuffs clicked shut. In that moment, she was no longer the evasive woman or ambiguous witness, but someone who had traded truth for fear over 24 years. As Rachel was led through the empty hallway, Nora watched, not with satisfaction, but with the familiar heaviness that came at the end of every cold case. No one walked away from this story unscathed. Outside, rain began falling lightly on the steps of the Logan police station, as if the town finally knew what had been buried in Wayne Forest for over 2 decades, and now had to face that truth as it stepped out of the darkness. Rachel Porter, finally, could no longer keep the secret another day. The trial of Grant Porter took place in late fall 2016 at the Hocking County Courthouse, in the old wood-paneled room, freshly painted white, but still retaining the familiar creak when the jury seats were pulled out each morning. And from the very first day, the courtroom atmosphere carried an unusual weight. Not only because this was a rare cold case resolved after more than 2 decades, but because Logan was a small town where everyone knew each other, where the trial was not merely judging one individual, but exposing a 24-year fracture in the community. Grant was brought in wearing a dark suit, thinner and grayer than the proud man on his porch in 1991. He did not look at the public gallery, where a few Logan residents and 2 Mercer family members sat quietly. When the judge read the indictment, second-degree murder, concealment of a corpse, and serious obstruction of investigation, Grant kept his eyes down, but Nora, sitting behind the prosecutor, saw his hands clenched, as if each word squeezed his bones. Prosecutor Brian Halley opened with a short but razor-sharp statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is a story of silence, concealment, and time. But time does not erase truth, and the truth will be fully presented to you." The jury listened, mostly residents from neighboring towns, selected for impartiality. Halley began by reconstructing the 1991 context. Ethan Mercer, 24, disappeared after leaving work. His truck found in a vacant lot, the Porter home never searched, the case closed for lack of evidence. Then he moved to the crucial part. Without modern forensic technology, we would not be here today. At trial, each piece of evidence was presented not in lab technical language, but in terms understandable to those unfamiliar with forensics. First, Halley called materials analyst Thomas Laird. He presented the reconstruction of how the Porter home's glass door was broken. On the large screen behind him, magnified images of the glass fracture appeared, cracks radiating from a single point, matching the pattern of high-speed impact from outside. "This was not an accident," Laird said clearly. "This was forceful impact. A person pushed into the door, or a heavy object used to strike it. Either way, the glass could not break like that on its own." Grant shifted uncomfortably in his seat, eyes avoiding the screen. Next, forensics from Ethan's truck were presented by expert Harris. He explained the luminol blood detection, foreign fabric fibers, and heavy scratches on the truck door. When images of the door under special light appeared, the courtroom fell completely silent. This was not a casually abandoned vehicle, Harris concluded. This was a vehicle involved in a violent event before being left. No one looked away from the screen until the final slide faded, leaving brief darkness like a submerged note in the room. But the heaviest evidence came when Lynn Evans was called. She presented DNA results from the underside of the old deck wood. 2 samples analyzed. Both matched Ethan Mercer's DNA with over 99.999% probability. The courtroom went silent, as if everyone realized this was no longer a case of speculation, but one with irrefutable biological evidence. In the back row, Linda Mercer raised her hand to her mouth, shoulders trembling slightly, while Nora quietly placed her hand on the seat back in front to steady herself. Halley pressed further. "Miss Evans, where was the blood located?" "On the underside of the deck," Evans answered. "In a place a person could not accidentally reach. The blood seeped from above down." The jury took constant notes. Some looked up at Grant, as if trying to gauge his reaction. Then the prosecution called the lead forensic from the Wayne National Forest excavation. He recounted the recovery process, discovery of fabric pieces, the truck key, and the skeleton matching Ethan's height and age. When images of the skull and personal items were shown, many turned away in pain, but they had to look. It was the truth they were responsible for weighing. Finally, Hallie called the most critical witness, Nora Coleman. Nora presented the entire modern investigation process, how 2015 forensics reopened the case, how Rachel's new statements were cross-checked, and how Grant confessed the burial location. Defense counsel rose to object to the confession part, but the judge allowed it due to full recording and Grant's voluntary statement, "I'll show you where." When Nora read that line, the jury exchanged glances. Everyone recognized it as the turning point ending 24 years of denial. When the prosecution concluded its case, Hallie stepped toward the jury and left a final line. "No one wanted this case to end in tragedy, but we cannot allow silence to continue. Ethan has been silent too long. Today, the truth is no longer under the soil of Wayne Forest. It is right before you." The courtroom fell into heavy silence that seemed to freeze the entire space. When defense took its turn, Grant's attorney tried to argue. No direct witness saw Grant cause Ethan's death, that the impact could have been accidental, that Grant only panicked, but those words fell like stones into water without a ripple. No juror looked away from the DNA evidence and recorded confession. When everything closed, the jury was sent to deliberate. They returned in under 4 hours, a number speaking to the case's clarity. The judge asked, "Your verdict?" The foreperson stood, holding the paper, voice ringing clear in the breathless room. "We find the defendant Grant Porter guilty of second-degree murder." Linda Mercer broke into tears. Grant closed his eyes, his entire body collapsing, as if finally hearing the sentence he knew he would hear since entering the courtroom. The judge read the sentence, 38 years imprisonment, within the range for murder with corpse concealment. The gavel struck like silent thunder in the room. No cheers, no protests, only heavy silence like ash. And as Grant was led away, head bowed, the entire town of Logan, Ohio, understood that this trial had closed, not only a criminal case, but a darkness that had covered them for over 2 decades. When the verdict for Grant Porter echoed through the Hocking County courtroom, the aftershock spread across Logan like a cold wind. No one was prepared for, not the whispers in the diners, not the frantic phone calls, or the first articles hitting the front pages, but a prolonged silence, so deep you could hear the faint creak of wooden doors whenever the wind blew through town. Logan had lived with Ethan's disappearance, like a shadow lingering just behind them, a story no one spoke aloud, but that was always there in late nights, or whenever someone passed the road where he was last seen. But when the truth came out, the blood on the deck, the broken glass, the rock crevice in Wayne National Forest, that shadow turned into something sharp and real, so tangible that everyone felt touched by it, stinging like a wound they thought had long healed. Neighbors avoided eye contact on the streets. Those who had known Grant since high school now stumbled over words when talking about him. People recalled moments from 1991 with hesitation, as if touching memories they wanted to deny. But the deepest impact didn't fall on the town. It fell on the Mercer family. Jacob Mercer, only 4 years old when Ethan vanished, now a grown man, stood before his father's freshly dug grave in the small cemetery on the edge of Logan. He stood still for a long time, hands in his coat pockets, his gaze not that of someone trying to cry, but of someone trying to grasp the feeling of facing for the first time something he had only known through fragmented stories his whole life. Ethan's grave was simple, a gray granite slab engraved with his name, birth year, death year, and a line chosen by Linda Mercer, "He came home at last." Jacob knelt down, placed his hand on the still cold stone, and in that moment, he understood that he wasn't just standing before his father's grave, but before the remainder of the questions that had followed him for years. Did his dad suffer? Was he lonely? Did he know that somewhere, a little boy was still waiting for him to come home? He didn't say it out loud, but in the cemetery's silence, it didn't seem to matter. The questions didn't need answers, only acknowledgement. Linda Mercer stood a few steps from her son, holding a bouquet of white daisies. After 24 years, she finally knew where her child lay. Knew the truth was no longer buried under forest rocks. Knew that what had gnawed at her for years was no longer vague, but a pain with clear shape. As she placed the bouquet at the foot of the grave, a gentle wind blew through like a long-held sigh finally released. She whispered, "You're home now, Ethan. I found you." The Logan officers who had searched for Ethan in 1991 and were now nearing retirement also carried the aftershock of the truth. One admitted he had thought about the deck that year, but had no warrant to search. Another recalled the unease standing outside the porterhouse at night, but having to accept the limits of the era. No one said it outright, but clearly, the truth surfacing, after 24 years, also brought regret for a system that once lacked the tools to look deeper into what intuition had suggested. In town, the Logan Diner, where a "Have you seen Ethan Mercer" poster hung in 1991, placed a bouquet by the door. The owner told regulars it was to remember Ethan, but really, it was the town's way of acknowledging how far time had carried them from that day. And now they were turning back, facing what they had tried to avoid for years. The people of Logan didn't split into sides supporting or opposing Grant. They were simply torn between the familiarity of a man they used to greet every morning and the truth of what he had done. But no matter how much Logan mourned the old image of their town, they couldn't deny that the Ethan Mercer case had changed them forever. Schools held talks on community safety. Churches held special prayer services. Some families revisited things they had overlooked, or children they had let play unsupervised without thinking twice. Logan entered a new era, not one of fear, but one of lessons no longer in rumors or stories, but in absolute truth. And that truth carved an indelible wound into the town. Still, Logan didn't collapse. The houses along the main road kept their porch lights on every night. Couples still drove their kids to school. The local radio news still played every morning as usual. The Ethan Mercer case didn't destroy the town, it made it grow up, quieter, and more willing to look into the dark corners it had previously trusted too much in its peace to face. As Jacob and Linda left the cemetery, they paused on the Forest Edge Road leading back to Logan. Late autumn Ohio sky glowed golden, wind blowing through the fiery red trees like a belated but sincere farewell. Ethan had finally been brought home to his family, to the name that had hung too long between disappearance and hope. Logan shook off part of its darkness, but kept the scar, a scar reminding residents that truth can stay silent, but it never vanishes. And sometimes, it takes 24 years for a drop of blood under an old deck to find its way back to the light. But when it does, it brings not just justice, but the transformation of a small town carrying more wounds than it ever dared admit. The 24-year investigation in Ethan Mercer's story clearly reflects a reality that American society today must confront, even though the legal system and forensic science have advanced tremendously. The truth is sometimes still buried by fear, silence, and the closed boundaries of tight-knit communities. Logan, Ohio in the story is a small town. Like thousands of towns across America, where everyone knows each other, where the culture of not interfering in others' business can easily become fertile ground for dangerous secrets to linger longer than they should. Rachel Porter is a prime example. 24 years of silence out of fear, psychological control, and believing that hiding the truth would be better for the family. But the result was the complete opposite. Silence protected no one. It only hurt more people. The lesson for American society today lies in that very tragedy. When domestic violence, emotional control, and dangerous behavior are hidden under the guise of keeping the peace, the consequences don't stay confined within the four walls of a home. The truth about the repainted deck, the replaced glass, the loud noise Rachel heard that night, all were warning signs that the community and she herself ignored. In the context of today's America, where domestic violence and psychological control still quietly occur in many places. This story reminds us that every unusual sign, a loud argument, strange noises, someone suddenly disappearing, should never be dismissed as private matters. The persistence of Nora Coleman and the 2015 forensic advances also point to an important lesson. Justice sometimes arrives very late, but it only arrives when people keep asking questions. For Americans today, that means continually demanding transparency, not avoiding the unusual, and being willing to speak up when intuition says something is wrong. Because, as Logan learned after 24 years, silence can sometimes be the most dangerous accomplice. Thank you for joining us on this journey to bring light back to a case that seemed forever lost in the shadows of Logan. If you want to keep following stories told with truth, perseverance, and humanity, please remember to subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video, where we continue opening doors that time once tried to close.